Well, there are many existing standards bodies that are focused on the technical specification of next generation broadband. But the WBBA has been created to focus on the business, financial, and the regulatory challenges of creating a viable, next generation broadband industry over the coming 10 to 15 years.
Today, broadband networks and the services that ride atop are, to many, deemed critical national infrastructure, essential to our modern digital lives in all of its forms. Yet, as an industry, we are somewhat overlooked, few noticing the wonders of the physics and many taking for granted the service until it's no longer there. The World Broadband Association has agreed a shared vision, ultra broadband for all, as a key enabler for a more equitable, sustainable future.
We're working with the World Broadband Association to try and get the high-speed, low-latency connectivity to suburban and rural communities. Many parts of the world focused on getting broadband connectivity to metro and metropolitan areas, and we believe that this high-speed, low-latency connectivity is required in the more rural areas to try and get the digital transformation so badly needed for these businesses.
For most of us, 2022 has been a year of change. Post-pandemic social and economic recovery has picked up steam over the past year, and we are learning how to both survive and thrive in this new normal. This year has also been a year of growth for the WBBA. We have overhauled our organizational structure, and more members from around the world, including telecom operators, vendors, investors, are now on board, truly making the WBBA an increasingly important platform for international collaboration within the broadband industry.
All countries, therefore, regardless of their broadband legacy, should aim to develop a network that meets the World Broadband Association's vision of ultra-high-speed connectivity for all, a converged network that will help accelerate monetization, an agile network that enables new business models, full automation to maximize network and operations optimization, and a network that is fully secure and has minimal impact on the environment.
WBBA is an international platform focusing on the development of the cloud, broadband, and committed to promoting broadband industry cooperation. China Telecom will be more than glad to share our experiences in cloud broadband with global industrial chain partners, jointly build a new cloud network convergence infrastructure, connect the world, and enable the digital transformation forward a prosperous future.
We've gone from kilobits per second to megabits per second. We're now in the gigabit era. It's quite amazing what we're achieving, and broadband is actually changing people's lives. So the single most important thing that the World Broadband Association has to do over the next couple of years is to create that same sense of excitement with people everywhere about broadband, to influence policymakers, regulators, investors, that broadband is something that everybody needs and that we need to invest in.
Chorus joined the WBBA because we believe that it will help identify and drive share goals across the broadband industry. We know that as a collective, we can learn from each other's, grow, and adapt to the future trends in our dynamic industry. In a short period of time, the WBBA has already released several white papers and is running global workshops looking at the various opportunities and the challenges ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining today's World Broadband Association annual event. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are joining us online today. Just before we get started, just a notice that we are running a simultaneous translation service throughout this afternoon's event. Please choose channel 2 from your headset for Mandarin and channel 3 for Thai. My name is Mark Oliver. I'm Senior Consulting Director of Omdia, the research and consulting arm of Informa Tech. I'm delighted to have been a member of the World Broadband Association since its inception last year. And I'm also very pleased to be your host for the event throughout this afternoon. I just want to take a step back for a moment and revisit how we've come to be here today at this World Broadband Association event. At the end of 2020, Omdia published a research paper called Delivering on the Promises of Broadband. And whilst our research showed that fixed broadband revenues will grow faster on an annual basis than mobile revenues until 2026, we also identified that there are a number of industry challenges which need to be addressed if broadband is really to deliver on all the promises that it's capable of. And you can see some of those key industry challenges that we highlighted on the screen here. On releasing this paper, we were challenged by some of our industry partners as to, why are these industry challenges perpetuating? What is it that we need to do to begin to address them? And we looked at the fact that, the broadband industry is a potentially very fragmented ecosystem, and that there is a need to bring together all of those different stakeholders from across the ecosystem if we are to effectively address the challenges you see on the slide here. And it's from there that the World Broadband Association was born, with the goal to provide an open organization and platform for collaboration and partnership so that we can address these challenges and deliver on our goal of connecting the world with broadband for all. When we started out on this journey, we were talking to prospective members and then bringing members into the association. One of the key motivations for joining the World Broadband Association was this desire to create a collective voice for the broadband industry. And not just that, to create a collective voice which is differentiated and distinct from the good work already being done by established bodies in the standards and the policy-making spheres, which we hope to be complementary to. What you can see on this slide here is just some of the ways that we've gone about building this collective voice since the World Broadband Association's launch in July of 2021. And that's included mobilizing working groups to look at the hot topics of the day, and we'll hear more about those through the course of this afternoon. It's also been a goal of ours to produce custom thought leadership underpinned by World Broadband Association intellectual property. And we've been doing that through the course of white papers and video presentations over the course of 2022. We've also been running digital media campaigns, building our social presence, and also running events like this one here today, and also a sister event in Amsterdam last week. What we're also delighted to announce is by the end of this year, the World Broadband Association will be registered as an independent legal entity in Switzerland. Just a very short call to action from me before we look at today's agenda. We'd be delighted for you to join the World Broadband Association on its journey and to join the selection of members you see up on the slide here right now. There are registration forms we'd be happy to collect on your desks. Alternatively, come and find me at any point during this afternoon, or find us on the World Broadband Association website and the membership inquiries function there. We'd be delighted to discuss with you how you can benefit from and contribute to your free membership of the WBBA. So what is it that we're going to discuss together here this afternoon? What we'll do first of all is we'll look at how the industry needs to address challenges including affordability, access, coverage and digital services, among others, if it's to boost the socio-economic development of Asia Pacific, with Atsuko Okuda, the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific at the ITU. We'll then examine how we close that digital divide through future-proofed investments in digital infrastructure by examining broadband business models and funding strategies with Vishesh Gupta, General Manager from Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. The development of the broadband is, of course, at different stages across different markets in the world. And China Telecom will share with us online as to how its all-optical 2.0 network is empowering sustainable broadband development with Junjie Li, Chief Expert of the Optical Transport Network at China Telecom. Global broadband trends and the importance of connecting the unconnected, unlocking innovation and future-proofing the network is something that we'll analyze together with WBBA member Sunil Piyal from OpenServe. F5G has already driven digital transformation in areas including transformation, healthcare, energy, and more. And what we'll do is we'll look at its next stage in its evolution with Dr. Songying Tang, Chief Scientist of China Unicom, before my Omdia colleague and research practice leader, Adrian Ho, will join us to look at how we best make the case for greater broadband investment, looking at the enterprise and consumer demands of the future and how we can unlock those to drive socio-economic development. I'll also be hosting a panel of experts from across the operator, vendor, and investment communities to assess success stories and strategies for driving broadband development now and in the future. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and panelists for their support, not just in making today's event a success, but the ongoing success of the World Broadband Association. And I'm delighted to introduce onto the stage World Broadband Association Director General Martin Kriener to deliver his welcome and keynote address. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone, and I'm delighted to be here at the first face-to-face event for the World Broadband Association here in Asia. We had an event last week in Amsterdam, as Mark mentioned, a sister event to this particular one. And it's very important because the World Broadband Association is at the start of a really important journey. So I'll give you a little bit of a background in terms of the areas that we're working in at the moment, a little bit of background about me as well. I've been in the telecoms industry, I suppose, for sadly over 35 years at this stage, plenty of gray hair, from an industry that has moved up and down and left and right over a long period of time. In the past, I've worked with a number of different companies in the industry, but I was also the president and CEO of the TM Forum, which is the global standards body for the software aspect of the telecoms industry, and is actually holding a pairing summit in the room just across the road there. And I've also written a number of books in this whole area. And this has all led me to have a very broad view, I think, of the challenges we're facing and also the opportunities that are surrounding us as we try and create an industry that is capable of transforming different parts of the world, whilst also transforming the industry itself. As Mark has mentioned, the World Broadband Association is really about bringing together broadband stakeholders and decision makers to develop the industry effectively. And we've been running it really, I suppose, for the last 9 months in a very active way to try and start working out the areas where we need to be developing solutions and new approaches, and the main problems that we're trying to address as an industry. So, whilst we're talking about bringing together an industry, I think of an industry as a mixture between the supply side and the demand side of broadband. The supply side of broadband is kind of the obvious answer of the operators and the big suppliers who supply the capabilities to those operators. The supply side are the people who create broadband and provide that to the world. And understanding that, they're the key initial members of the World Broadband Association. But of course, the demand side on this is hugely interesting as well. And it's the people who are on the consumer side, creating everything from the need, the pull for basic connectivity to the advanced connectivity that's going to be needed as we move into a metaverse world that is talked about and as yet not very well defined. But I think there's a general consensus that we are evolving to a world that will need more and more connectivity. That won't just be providable by the mobile solutions that we've got at the moment. But there's also requirements in the B2B world, in healthcare, in automotive, in manufacturing, in ports, and so on. And there's a broad demand for connectivity and new capabilities that are coming from these vertical industries, as well as from the actual people who are creating the devices, whether they're VR headsets or chips and so on. So my vision of the World Broadband Association is that we'll embrace that whole community. It is starting with the supply side. It'll very rapidly grow out to add in this demand side, as well as other stakeholders, because success in broadband is not going to be achieved purely as a vision from the supply side. And I don't think it's even achievable as a supply and demand side vision. I think it needs the understanding and buy-in from the investment community and governments, as well as regulators and the hyperscalers who are providing the associated aspects of the cloud and so on. And the real vision for the WBBA is to accelerate the timely emergence of next generation broadband everywhere. And timely might be over the next 2 to 3 years. It might be already here today. It might be 10 to 20 years. But it's to accelerate that wherever we can, and in a fashion that's going to create a sustainable long-term return on investment for the key stakeholders. And the stakeholders are kind of everybody on that chart. And one of the big issues I've seen in my 35 years in the industry is the fragility of the return on investment structure for the telco industry, and it's become more fragile as the years have gone by. And the WBBA has a clear focus on trying to generate that sustainable ROI structure. Mark mentioned we've been working in a few different areas over the last 9 months. As he also mentioned, WBBA is still being legally formed, but that hasn't stopped the founding members from pushing forward on a number of key areas. So there's been a very interesting piece of work done around the greater broadband investment and the argument for that and the importance of it. We've also done a piece of work around developing the roadmap for next generation. And that roadmap is really a mapping to other work that's going on within ETSI and elsewhere on the future roadmaps of associated technologies with next generation broadband, but trying to pull that together into a broadband-centric roadmap. We've done a lot of work on developing our view for the environmental sustainability challenges, and also trying to build up the broadband success stories. I'll very briefly go through each one of these, just in terms of, you can download them. Actually, I think they may be on the memory sticks that are in front of you as well. All of that material may well be there, but it's certainly all downloadable from the Broadband Association website. But in terms of the importance of greater broadband investment, I think it's very clear there's a lot of correlation between broadband investment and GDP. And the better the quality of broadband investment, the stronger the correlation and the better the results. And this is a piece of work that was done by the World Broadband Association, commissioned research with Omdia and others to produce this. But it's also very clear that if next generation of broadband is going to be fiber-based, it's not necessarily all going to be achievable purely by the existing business models and existing business cases funded and driven by the telco industry and their existing investors. We need a new business case or an enhanced business case so that we can get fiber everywhere. And it's not entirely clear what that's going to be, but it's going to involve all the stakeholders I showed on the previous slide. And the governments are going to have an important role to play, maybe in terms of funding to some extent, or more likely just in terms of restructures in terms of regulatory approaches, so that there can be an achievable ROI for the other stakeholders to invest. And it's going to be things around regulatory barriers around things like copper switch-off legislation and so on. So that's what's covered in the importance of greater broadband investment. We've also been developing the next generation roadmap, and this maps very well to the F5G roadmap that we're going to talk about. It maps also to the mobile view of 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and so on. But this is a roadmap that tries to look at where we are today, which is what we call BB4 or BB5, somewhere in that, depending on what part of the world you're in. And it looks at what's going to be capable and what's the requirements in BB 5.5 and BB 6. And there's parts of the world still in BB 3 or even earlier generations. And part of the goal of the World Broadband Association is going to try and work out how can we build a business rationale and business case for accelerating those parts of the world onto this roadmap. And when we look at the different characteristics of each of the generations, those characteristics are not just about the speed of broadband, though that is always one of the main topics that gets talked about. Certainly latency, certainly the level of intelligence that's going to exist within those next generations, as well as the sensing capabilities, how trustworthy, how green, and so on each of these generations are. So if you read this document, it outlines our thoughts as a membership on what these generations are going to look like. And this chart sort of summarizes some of the views, but I think as soon as we published this document, we've come to realization that the devil is in the detail, and we need to go into every single square on this table and really flesh out what we mean by the next generation of broadband. What do we mean by reliability and latency in BB5, 5.5, and BB6? We certainly spent some time working on gathering together broadband case studies, because the world is already on this broadband journey, and certain parts of the world are moving very rapidly and other parts are moving less rapidly. And so one of the jobs of the World Broadband Association is try and gather together some of the excellent work that's already been done so that other people can emulate it and copy it in terms of sensible solutions, sensible business cases for point solutions in order to accelerate that in their particular region. You can download the broadband case studies and success stories, a white paper as well. And then finally, the importance of environmental sustainability in that the role that broadband plays in driving the sustainability arguments. And I won't go into this in any great detail, but it is very clear that the telecom industry has a huge role to play in sustainability, both in terms of dealing with its own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but also changing and enabling other parts of the world in terms of driving the sustainability progress across the world. And this white paper looks at that in detail and picks out the key areas for focus in the telecoms industry. And fiber, of course, plays a hugely important role in all of this, because fiber is undoubtedly the most efficient technology that we can deploy. And it's a matter of how do we get into that world where we can deploy fiber and achieve those sustainability goals. Final thought is there's a set of upcoming work within the World Broadband Association. So we've run a number of working teams over the last 4 or 5 months. Those teams are now going to evolve into a new set of working teams on a range of topics. Broadband advocacy, really understanding the economic and political rationale for accelerated broadband investment. Looking at trying to develop a clear view of the demand side requirements and timing of those requirements. So we've looked at the supply side view of what the roadmap for next generation is going to look like, but we need to understand what the demand side is going to require. And that means broadening the reach of the World Broadband Association to ensure that we get the views in from this wider demand side of stakeholders. We need to refine that next generation roadmap. As I mentioned, we've got a first cut of what we mean by each of the generations, but we need to have much more detail on what the actual capabilities the supply side is going to deliver to the world over the coming years. We need to see the role of broadband in environmental sustainability, and that really is about broadening out our understanding of the role of broadband in driving the sustainable development goals and so on of the United Nations. And then finally, we've got a new working group on the whole area of network topology, because it's one thing to say that this is the next generation of broadband. It's an entirely different discussion to talk about how this is going to be delivered by the industry and what network topologies and what structures are going to be required in order to do that. So with that very brief overview of the work of the WBBA over the last number of months, I'm going to hand you back to Mark, and let's talk about some of the insightful views we're going to hear from our speakers today. And I do encourage you, if your organization is not part of the WBBA yet, please reach out and get involved. The topics we're addressing and covering, we're in it for the long haul, and the topics we're addressing and covering are going to be important to every player in the industry over the coming months and years and decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. And just to confirm that all of the thought leadership that Martin was walking us through there is available for you on the memory stick that you should have received on entering the room. And we welcome all feedback, thoughts, or challenges, in fact, on what we've produced, and we'll be delighted to discuss it further with you. I'd now like to welcome onto stage to discuss how broadband can boost the socio-economic development of Asia Pacific, Regional Director of the ITU, Atsuko Akuda. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting ITU to this very interesting, insightful event today. My name is Atsuko Okuda. I am the Regional Director of ITU Regional Office for Asia and Pacific. I will talk a little bit about the demand side, as Martin just discussed, and how broadband interacts with socio-economic development. I'm pretty sure that the audience know about ITU already, but for those who may heard about ITU for the first time, we are the oldest UN agency specialized in information and communication technology, and we were established in 1865 at the time of telegraph. And I'm sure that many of you are already working in the radio communication sector of ITU, as well as standardization, but you may or may not be interacting with the development side. We have the mandate of connecting the unconnected by 2030. Let me just start with that mandate of connecting the unconnected. And Martin also mentioned about the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals of ITU. This is the results of the latest regional review of SDGs and where we are. I don't know how you feel about it. As of 2022, we are not actually on track on all of the SDGs. In some cases, especially in the environment sector, we are regressing. So there is a high expectation from the different communities for digital technology to support, accelerate, and deliver the socio-economic benefits. And for that, we need connectivity. And another indication, this slide shows the impact of COVID. Some of you may know that our sister agency called UNDP produces a report on human development. And that looks at the well-being of people, access to education and health and so forth. And as you can see, we were progressing quite well until COVID hit. So we are seeing a decline for the first time. And that really shows not only the economic impact of COVID, but on the well-being of people. And how does that translate into the ICT sector then? According to the latest ITU estimates, there are still 2.7 billion people offline. Now, I don't know how you feel about the number, because last year, the number was 2.9. And we were totally shocked because that showed that in the span of 2 years, there were 800 million people who joined the internet for the first time. So there was a significant rapid increase in the number. But if you think about it, this year, it's 2.7. That clearly shows that the growth rate has been slowed. So now everyone got onto the internet, but there are still 2.7 billion people, and 96% of them are living in developing countries. Now, I did want to do the bar chart, but in an alphabetical order, I listed the Asia and the Pacific member countries and the fixed broadband subscriptions. And I'm pretty sure you have seen it. ITU collects the ICT data. We have a number of data such as mobile broadband, fixed broadband subscriptions, as well as affordability. And you can see that there is a wide disparity across the region. ITU covers 38 countries from Iran eastward. So we have, of course, the top performers and the rest. And the rest are not really making progress fast enough to catch up. And I also want to highlight that some of these countries are showing a decline in fixed broadband subscriptions. So this is something perhaps this group may want to pay attention to. And we are also very curious about the reasons. And I just want to also talk about a little bit about ITU data. As you know, ITU publishes the data that we have, and by country and by type of indicators, you can see all kinds of figures. So this is a snapshot summary of Thailand, for example. We have, for example, the data on fixed broadband subscriptions per 100. So it's 16. It's on par with the global average. And the individuals using the internet, 78%, which is above the world average, as well as the population coverage, regulatory authority institutional structure, the universal access service scheme, foreign industry participation, and so forth. And I hope that this information, as well as the other data, is found useful by the audience. And this is a comparison for Asia and the Pacific as a whole. So we also aggregate and disaggregate the number by region as well as by the type of information. So even though we believe that Asia and the Pacific is doing well, compared to other regions, we are perhaps in the middle. We could do more. And in terms of the market structure, on average, we have 33% foreign participation, as well as a level of competition and so forth. I think we can do more as a whole. Now, I also mentioned very briefly earlier about affordability. In order for people to subscribe or increase the subscription, the affordability is the key. If you cannot afford it, you will not be able to subscribe. And this is the chart which worries us most, because as you know, 2% of our GNI per capita is the benchmark set by the Broadband Commission to be the affordable benchmark. So any country below 2% is good. It is affordable. They can subscribe. And the above are unaffordable. So we have many countries in Asia and the Pacific which are providing, which cannot provide affordable broadband as of today. Now, this is again another worrying sign. We were seeing a progressive trend in the past, but because of COVID, more countries actually fell in the category of unaffordable broadband services. So there are countries which succeeded to bring it down, the cost, but there are more countries which increased the cost and it became unaffordable. And this is again another chart. As you see, the affordability and progress were made significantly in high-income countries, in particular in Europe. But the rest, we are seeing maybe less progress and improvement in terms of the affordability. Now, this is worrying. Why? because if you look at some of the empirical studies, this is one of them conducted by ITU, we clearly see a strong correlation, as Martin mentioned earlier, between broadband and economic growth. So the countries with better broadband connectivity had less economic impact from COVID. So that means that if something hits tomorrow or next month, those who have broadband access may be able to weather it better than those without. And this is another study on the health side. The University of Chicago and Tufts University conducted a study on the COVID death in the United States. They looked at all the indicators: income, location, ethnicity, education level, and so forth. And they identified broadband as one of the key aspects to determine who died and who didn't. So those people who are living in urban areas with internet access died less from COVID. And I thought that this is really a significant finding for us. There is a justification why internet or broadband is so important. Now, I'm pretty sure that you're wondering, so what is it that ITU is doing with all the convincing evidence of why broadband? And let me just share with you some of the products and tools that we have developed and we are using in our work. I hope that you have seen the ITU transmission map. We have a global map of cables and fiber optics and submarine cables globally, and we keep track of where the cables are landing, which shows, very broadly speaking, which communities and cities can be connected. And on top of that, we have this last mile connectivity toolkit, which enable us to calculate how much it will cost and based on which technology. And that, we hope, is a good tool to plan the investment. And additionally, I hope that all of you know already, ITU and UNICEF are working to connect the unconnected schools. So as of today, we have this a project called GIGA, which covers globally, and we are also supported by the UK FCDO to promote the more conducive policy environment, investment, and mapping of the unconnected schools, so that the next step of planning the investment, inviting industry, and training the schools and teachers can proceed. So as we speak, we have this project in Indonesia. We have produced a few forward-looking studies and recommendations, and we have a similar initiative in other countries too. Now, additionally, we are hoping that the same model or similar model can be applied to the health sector. As you may know, it's very hard to get the number of connected hospitals or health clinics in Asia and the Pacific. And our sense is that they are not, especially outside big cities. This is worrying. Coming from the COVID pandemic, I think this is some of the sectors that will require more close attention, and this is where we need your support, the industry support, to continue connecting these important institutions. Now, in addition to the actual initiatives and approaches, we have been doing the analysis and development of good practices on policy and regulation. Some of these topics, I hope, will be helpful to reduce the costs and investment, as well as to encourage more investment into fiber deployment. And one of them is the co-deployment with transport and energy. So we have conducted case studies on co-deployment in Bangladesh, India, China, and how successfully the broadband was deployed along with other infrastructure. Additionally, we are working with other sectors. The key for us is the whole of government approach. We learned a lot of lessons from the past. In the past, there were many sectoral digital initiatives, as you know, education, health, agriculture, commerce, and so forth. There is nothing wrong about it. But if we work together, perhaps we can produce more results, more efficiencies. So what we do is that along the SDGs on the left-hand side, we translate it into ICT terminology, which is the whole of government approach, providing connectivity, the GovStack, the one in the middle, which is the whole of government approach to digital government. And we are supporting, as we speak, the smart village, smart islands, and smart cities so that people can interact meaningfully to the whole digital services and resources. And additionally, we conduct assessment on actual connectivity studies, such as Net Pracharat, which is a very successful case here in Thailand. As you know, all the villages, almost all, are connected through this initiative in partnership with industry and service providers. And we were asked to estimate the beneficiaries and the benefits of this initiative. And the preliminary study results show that farmers perhaps benefited most, especially rice farmers, and in remote areas. This initiative clearly shows the positive socio-economic impact of broadband initiatives such as Net Pracharat in Thailand. And I hope that we can do more of this so that that can be used as the basis for investment decision in other countries. And this is the last slide. Often we are asked, so what? So what do people do when they are connected? We have also a lot of digital inclusion initiatives focusing on girls and young women, as well as youth, as you see, and people with disabilities and older persons, because their needs are very specific and different. So in partnership with industry, in particular Huawei, we have been supporting the digital skills and digital capacity development of the youth, in particular here in Thailand, and you see a lot of youth who benefited from our partnership and capacity development, and they will be the customers and users of the broadband, and they can become entrepreneurs and they can become digital farmers. And I hope that we can do more once they are connected. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and I hope that the slides were found interesting, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. So thank you.
Thank you, Atsuko. I think some particularly challenging insights there when we look at that correlation between fixed broadband connectivity and economic resilience and COVID survival rates. I think that sets a very good course for the WBBA's focus and ambitions in the future. I'd now like to welcome on screen Dr. Junjae Lee, Chief Expert of the Optical Transport Network from China Telecom.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to see you online and have this opportunity to give my presentation. The topic of today's event is about broadband communications. Exactly because of the popularity of the broadband worldwide, we can meet remotely through the internet, even under the travel restrictions. Today, I'm going to introduce China Telecom's all-optical networking tool strategy and how it enables the sustainable development of our broadband services, followed by our expectations about WBBA in the end. At present, the digital economy has become the critical role globally. Broadband network has become a very important part of digital information infrastructure, and also the key foundation for creating digital competitiveness. This slide shows the study of broadband popularity worldwide from Omidyar early this year. This study qualified the level of broadband development for each country by two indexes: broadband penetration rate and optic fiber permeability rate. We can see both these two indexes are quite different among countries and regions. Good news is that the global average of both reaches 63%, and the East Asian countries like China, Japan, Korea rank the top of the world. But we have seen that there are still many countries showing that their index is less than 40%. Some of them are even lower than 10%. I suppose that it's one essential mission for WBBA to promote the popularization of broadband all around the world, especially in those underdeveloped areas or countries. In the past 3 decades, China Telecom has made great progress in the development of broadband networks. Now, we have 177 million broadband subscribers. Among them, 98% are using fiber access. Our 10G-point facility has covered more than 300 cities, and more than 96 million users have home Wi-Fi coverage. According to our statistics and forecast, the capacity increased with CAGR for 23% from 2010 to 2030 in our backbone optical networks. But we are still facing 3 challenges to maintain sustainable development of broadband networks. First off, higher bandwidth. Cloud network convergence is reshaping our network. There are more and more video apps in our smartphones. The resolution is going up and people spend a lot of time on them. 4K, 8K facilities gradually enter thousands of houses. The steady commercial use of AR/VR and the concept of meta-universe, all these emerging technologies and services have constantly put forward higher requirements for transmission bandwidth. Secondly, lower cost. As network operators, we must continuously reduce the cost per bit to meet the user's affordable demand for the bandwidth in this bandwidth explosion era. We must reduce both the CapEx and OpEx. And OpEx may be more critical because total OpEx is estimated to be 3 times of CapEx for broadband networks if we analyze the TCO, total cost of ownership. The third one is lower power consumption. Green telecommunication stands for the future, which is in line with the global target of sustainable development for all human beings. China government has claimed the goal of emission peak in 2030 and carbon neutralization in 2060. All optical network, shortened as AON, is a solution proposed by China Telecom to meet the above challenges. The emerging stage of AON is from 2000 to 2007. We used both copper and fiber as the transmission media. Backbone and metro networks took the lead in using optical fibers, but the access network still mainly used copper wire. Then we entered AON 1.0 stage from 2008 to 2017. Changes came mainly in access layer. Optic fibers were widely deployed to replace copper wires. The third stage is from 2018 up to now. That is AON 2.0. Our optical access technology is further penetrated. Our optical transmission technology constantly increases both bitrate and capacity, introduces the new optical fiber and exploits new spectrum. The most significant progress is introducing ROADM-based optical switching technology. In addition, there are some new changes referring to network architecture and intelligent operation, which will be talked later. The target architecture of AON2 in the year of 2030 is a flatter network. National and provincial backbone optical network will be merged into one unified backbone network. Mature and access network will gradually converge together. In short, a simplified two-layer optical network will replace the current four-layer network. To be noticed that wavelengths will become the essential element of all optical transmission and the switching network. OTN and further OSU technology will enhance the capacity at sub-wavelength layer. PON and other optical access technologies will be developed from 2C to 2B scenarios. Meanwhile, the unified control of cloud and network is another important goal. New technologies such as SDN, telemetry, AI are planned to adopt in the new OSS system for more intelligence. Open and disaggregation of optical networks will be another hot topic and be introduced step by step. Now I'm going to show some new technologies and deployments of AON 2.0. First off, the foundation of the optical network, high speed and high capacity transmission. Now we plan to introduce single wavelength 400 gigabit per second system, which can experience 3 generations. The first generation used 16-core modulation format with symbol rate about 60 G-band, but is limited by transmission distance and is more suitable for short distance applications such as 400ZR. The second generation has applied the probabilistic constellation shaping 16-core. The symbol rate reaches about 90 G-band, and the maximum transmission distance is close to 1,000 kilometers without regeneration. The third generation will further increase the symbol rate to about 130 G-band to make sure the system can use QPSK modulation format with high performance, so it can support actual long-haul transmission distance of nearly 2,000 kilometers without regeneration. Although we have increased the bit rate of each wavelength from 100 to 400 in recent 10 years, but we haven't achieved the corresponding growth of capacity, so we are working toward this target via several innovations. The first innovation is to expand the new spectrum, specifically introducing the extended to the C-band and the L-band. The total capacity can be reached at 11 terahertz or even 12 terahertz with the use of 400 gigabit per second DWDM system in future. Critical changes for L-band optical amplifier comes from new fiber gain media, noise field control, and nonlinear effects like SRS. Another innovation comes from optical fibers. Single-mode fiber-based innovation has been considered first in order to be compatible with a large number of single-mode fibers under deployment. It has been proven that lower loss and larger effective area are two effective methods to improve the transmission performance of fibers. China Telecom has taken the lead in deploying ultra-low loss and large area G.654.E fiber in terrestrial optical cables. The world's first all G.654.E national backbone optical cable has been put into operation in the year of 2021, connecting Shanghai and Guangzhou. In the backbone network, China Telecom has fully applied optical switching network based on ROADM. The network has more than 460 ROADM nodes, over 800 terabits per second total bandwidth, and more than 3 million kilometers fiber links. It covers over 340 cities and all major data centers nationwide. Based on this ROADM network, we provide the capacity of rapid wavelength provision in minutes, quick failure recovery in seconds, and lower latency. For the metro networks, our optical network tools take actions to extend the optical network technology like WDM and OTN downward to central office. One driving force comes from the continuous bandwidth growth due to the development of both fixed and mobile broadband services. The number of match bandwidth has reached at several hundreds of gigabits per second, and the WDM is an ideal solution for saving optical fibers and managing the bandwidth. On the other hand, not all the customers require bandwidth in wavelength granularity. We must provide sub-wavelength fine granularity services with high QoS. China Telecom works together with partners to put forward the mature OTN with OSU containers as a key technology. Comparing with the legacy OTN, OSU enhances the bearing efficiency for small granular services, but is still compatible with traditional OTN via ODU layer. Now let's move to the topic of WBA, World Broadband Association. As a founding member, China Telecom has great expectations for WBA. We really hope that WBA will provide benefits to broadband network operators, service providers, cloud service providers, and other related stakeholders in the world. It will also play an important role in combining the global industry chain, promoting and strengthening communication and cooperation among the industry. Dear friends, currently we are entering the emerging digital economy area. The broadband industry is facing the opportunities and challenges, and we hope we can grow up together with WBA. We sincerely wish to see more and more partners can recognize and join WBA, and to create a better future and a wonderful world under the cooperation of all of us. Thank you very much.
With very many thanks to Dr. Junjie Li for providing that video presentation for us. From one WBBA founding member to another, I'm delighted to welcome on stage now from OpenServe, Sunil Piyalo.
Thank you, Mark. What an honor to be standing here in front of such an esteemed audience today. A few things I want to start to talk about before I get into my presentation. When I got off my flight from South Africa and I landed in Thailand, and people put their hands together and greeted me, it humbled me. From there, I went to the taxi and I got the same greeting. I then went to my hotel and I went to the shops and restaurants around and I got the same greeting. And today I choose to greet you in that way, Swadee Kap. What a humbling greeting. Congratulations to the Thai. Then I want to talk a little bit about when Mark and Jenny called me and said, I'd like you to do a keynote at the World Broadband Association event. And I said, what do I say to such an esteemed audience, a group of industry OEMs, industry leaders, industry experts? And you've seen a lot of technology presentations before me, so I decided not to go into technology, but to use a few pictures to try and convey a message to you, to try and welcome you to the World Broadband Association and to try and get you to join us to deliver on some of our visions and some of our missions. And I'm going to split my presentation into 4 themes. Firstly, let there be light. Let there be fiber. Let there be the presence of fiber. And secondly, I'll talk about what fiber brings you, the evolution of PON and the speed of fiber. Thirdly, I want to talk about the beauty of fiber. And you heard a lot today about green and about how fiber stimulates innovation. And lastly, I want to talk about the omnipresence of fiber and how we can get fiber throughout the world. So I chose this slide because on Monday this week, hundreds of millions of people around the world celebrated Deepavali. And I thought, what an appropriate way to start my conversation in talking about how they celebrated the victory of light over darkness. And what are we talking about here today? We're talking about light. We're talking about connecting the unconnected. We're talking about the beauty of light. And that is where I will start to say, let there be light. Let us as operators, let us as vendors, let us as industry leaders try and provide fiber to as many parts of this world as possible. And more importantly, I'm representing the African continent here, and I'll show you how I'm appealing to the world to get the African continent connected. So let's start off by saying, let there be light. And then I want to talk a little bit about the speed of light. And when I talk about the speed of light, I want to look at where we started. Let's go back to dial-up connectivity about 30 years ago. When I kind of started my career in communications. And if you had a dial-up modem making any form of sound and you were connected to any part of the world, you would jump for joy. And then we moved to ISDN, and with ISDN and 64 kilobits or 128 kilobits per second, you had bragging rights. You really, really had high-speed connectivity. And in the early 2000s, we saw ADSL come about. And then we saw the evolution of high-speed connectivity take off at quite a rapid pace. Around 2011, 2012, we saw the world deploying GPON as a technology. And colleagues, this is really the most technical slide I have. So apologies for getting into some of the technical terms, but I want to explain the evolution of PON because I believe it's important. 10 years ago, we started off with GPON, a technology that gives us about 2 gigabits per second download and 1 gigabit per second upload. And 5 years later, 6 years later, we see the world introducing XGS-PON, which is symmetrical 10 gigabits per second PON. And OpenServe, as an organization, has deployed XGS-PON in the South African network. There's countries across the world that have provided XGS-PON as connectivity, giving you up to 10 gigabits per second in your home. What are you going to do with that kind of bandwidth? I'll discuss in a few slides to come. But that's essentially where we're sitting now. Between 2015 and 2020, we've seen the introduction of XGS-PON. And we see the huge rollout of XGS-PON today across the world. And as we're starting to roll out XGS-PON, OpenServe, together with other companies, are starting to play around with 25 gig PON, giving you access to 20 gigabits per second at your home. And in sitting in the Huawei Ultra Broadband session yesterday, we saw the introduction of 50 gig PON. We saw equipment, we saw vendors starting to roll out 50 gig PON. Essentially, you're getting 40 gigabits per second access to your house. Most importantly, all of this taking place over one optical distribution network. All you're doing is you're changing the light. You're changing the light at the end of your distribution network. And what I want to highlight here is one of the reasons I joined the World Broadband Forum, the World Broadband Association, sorry, not the World Broadband Forum. I joined the World Broadband Association, and I'm actively involved in the generational roadmap where we're looking at applications and services for 2030 and beyond. And how do we keep up with applications, with services, with end-user devices, with the pace at which technology is evolving? Today, you've got gigabit access in your house. Gigabit connectivity is a norm. Do you have devices that can actually use that capability? Do you have hand user devices that can actually use 10 gigabit per second? Can you even do a speed test on your cell phone with 10 gigabits per second? So those are some of the questions we ask ourselves. And we get into these conversations with the World Broadband Association. We say, how do we develop a generational roadmap for 2030 and beyond to make sure that we link the OEMs, we link the device manufacturers with the pace of technology? So now that I've spoken about the pace of technology, now that I've spoken about the speed of technology, why do we need that speed? Why do we need such high-speed internet access? Let's start at the bottom of the screen. If you've got 4 megabits per second at home, if you have a 4 megabit per second DSL line, and I apologize for the size of the text if you can't read it, but essentially you need 4 megabits per second to watch a HD video. To downstream, to watch Netflix, you need 4 megabits per second. If you can afford 8K TV, you certainly can afford 1 gigabit per second line. And really you don't need that, but that's probably about 200 or 300 megabits per second to watch a very, very high definition 8K movie. So why do you need 10 gigabits per second? Why do you need 40 gigabits per second? And that's why I make the statement that human impatience is the killer app. If you want to download a 15 gigabit file, you don't want to wait an hour to do it. You want to do it in 10 or 15 seconds. You want to quickly download that file. And the reason I say human impatience is the killer app is because of that gratification, that instant gratification of knowing that when you want access to the speed, you can get it. You can quickly download the file and you can continue with the rest of your life. You don't have to watch the circle going round and round and go make a few cups of coffee and wait for download. So that is why you need it. You need it for instant gratification. You need it for cloud interactivity. And more importantly, for immersive virtual reality. And that's where we are heading with why technologies are evolving and the demand for high-speed connectivity. When I started off talking about in the early 1990s when a dial-up internet was sufficient. Today, if you have 10 gigabits per second at your house, you still want more, and purely for that instant gratification. So let's look at some of the trends, and I want to talk about two trends here, and again emphasizing why, as OpenServe, we've joined the World Broadband Association. The first trend is that gigabit is a reality. Many countries with fiber optic access around the world are providing at least a 1 gigabit per second service. And with that, we're seeing that some of the networks are 25 gig ready today. Not really selling services on it, but they are 25 gig ready, and in the very near future, you're going to start seeing the requirement for more and more 10 gig services. So when I looked and I just checked a few weeks before I got here, there was over 20 countries providing services, 10 gig services on XGS-PON. Chorus is one of them. China Telecom's big into it. So you can get 4 gigabit per second or 8 gigabit per second service at your home right now, today. And you're going to see more than 10 gig evolving soon. We saw the standard for 50 gig PON approved late last year. I think it was November last year. And then the other trend is that the world is going 5G. But importantly, with the world going 5G, is that 5G is going fixed. So to try and give you the wireless connectivity, the high-speed, low-latency connectivity that you would get from 5G, you're going to need at least a fiber connection to the site. I don't think microwave technology has reached the point where you can get a good enough backhaul on microwave to get the experience of 10 gigabit per second or more. Also, the reason the world is going fixed with 5G is the ease of deployment. Your optical distribution networks are there already. You don't have to go and roll out fiber. It's the tower companies that need to make space available. And I think Vishesh is going to talk a lot about that in his presentation about financing of tower companies. So what do we do as the World Broadband Association? And Martin and Mark have spoken a lot about this. And I'll just touch on it a little bit because it's part of my presentation and part of the reason I've joined the World Broadband Association. So I'm part of the Generational Roadmap Working Group, where we're looking at services and applications for 2030 and beyond. But the World Broadband Association also focuses on Working Group 2 that does case studies on industry and success stories in the industry. And then thirdly, about sustainability, looking at not just getting a greener and more sustainable network, but also sustainability from a return on investment perspective and sustainability of operators. And some of the challenges that we see in the industry and that the World Broadband Association is trying to address, one that every speaker today has touched on, is the inequality of broadband access. It's the ability to bridge that digital divide. It's the ability to try and assist in connecting the unconnected. And that a lot of my presentation is actually going to focus on that specific challenge. The second challenge is ensuring sustainability and providing return on investment for service providers. And then delivering end-to-end experience. Fourthly, developing impactful regulation and policy. And we saw Atsuko talk about the involvement of the ITU in the World Broadband Association and how we're getting standards developed and how we're getting regulation around the connectivity. Enabling vertical integration, and lastly, building a future-proof network. And I spoke about the speed, the evolution of PON, but using one optical distribution network. Building one network that is future-proof and just changing your end technologies, just changing your active equipment on that network. Having said that, I want to come to the third theme of my network, the beauty of light. And it was this week that the Thai have celebrated Loi Krathong. And it's not just the physical beauty of light. It's not just light lighting up the sky. But I want to talk about the beauty of light in its ability, again, to provide us with connectivity to the unconnected. The beauty of light to help us to bridge this digital divide that we've seen since the inception of the internet, since the inception of broadband connectivity. The beauty of light to do that in an economical and efficient way. The second thing I want to talk about, the beauty of light, is the beauty of light in its ability to unlock innovation, providing you with connectivity, providing you with high-speed connectivity, providing you with high-speed, low-latency connectivity, and unlocking innovation. What I want to highlight in unlocking innovation is the people that need it the most, the unconnected, the developing countries that need the high-speed, low-latency connectivity to let them participate in the digital transformation so badly needed, especially for small and medium enterprises, for small office, home office, participation in the fourth industrial revolution. And that is the beauty of light. Thirdly, we heard a lot of talk. I think every speaker spoke about going greener, about saving the planet, about the ability of fiber to use less power, the energy consumption of fiber, and how moving to fiber doesn't only help us from an economic sense in saving energy, saving us operating costs, but more importantly, in assisting us to get a greener planet. Lastly, I spoke about future-proofing the network. How do we future-proof the network? How do we stop continuously building? Copper has been around with us for a long time. And with fiber, we got to actually remove the copper and replace it. We're hoping that fiber would be around with us. If you deploy fiber now, the next 20 to 30 years, you can reuse that fiber. And hence my talk on rolling out one optical distribution network and just changing the technology on it. The evolution from GPON to XGS-PON to 25 gig PON is seamless. One optical distribution network. Just changing the lambda as you go to 50 gig PON and 100 gig PON allows you to use the same optical distribution network with the coexistence of other network elements. So that is the beauty of light. This is an interesting stat, and I saw Atsuko touch on it a little bit. And I talk about global internet usage statistics. This is a graph, and apologies if you cannot read the text at the bottom, but it shows percentage of users of internet from white to dark blue going from 10% to 100%. And if you look at the developing countries, let's look at most of the countries on the African continent. Look at their connectivity. Look at the white blocks that shows between 0 to 10%, not connectivity, but access to internet. And we've heard between Morten and Atsuko talk about the ability of connectivity to the internet to save lives. Just access to information during the COVID pandemic helped save lives. And the reason I put up this and the next slide is, it's not that we don't have light. We have light. If you look at the African continent and you look at the landing stations, the submarine landing stations, and you look at the access to bandwidth that we have along the continent connecting the east with the west, all the cables landing around the continent, and you go back to what happens to that bandwidth. What happens to this light? Does that light shine across the continent? That is where, as the World Broadband Association, we're looking at innovative ways. We're looking at ways to try and see how we can take this huge capacity that lands on our shorelines all across Africa into Africa. The huge capacity that lands on other continents that require connectivity. How do we take that, whether it's through 5G, whether it's through fiber, how do we provide some form of connectivity across the continent? I just showed that same stat graphically because I think it passes a stronger message. Here's where some of the first world countries are sitting, above 80% connectivity. Here's where Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa are sitting, about 20% average connectivity. The world average sitting at about 50%. Even the world average is not good enough. It's not good enough to have only 50% of the world having access to the internet. So just getting to my final slides, I want to speak about the omnipresence of light. How do we make sure that there is light everywhere? There's not just light shining in certain parts of the world, not just light shining on the first world countries, not just light passing through certain continents. I've shown you the slide on Africa where the light actually goes from the coastline, bypasses the continent, and connects the east to the west, connecting first world countries. So here I want to appeal to people that haven't been part of the World Broadband Association to join us. And I'll talk a little bit about that just now. Join us. Join China Telecom. Join OpenReach. Join Swisscom. Join Huawei and Nokia. Join Omdia. Join Chorus. And join me as OpenServe. Join us to try and bridge this digital divide. Join us to try and get connectivity to the unconnected. Join us to give people access to the internet, and especially with the developing countries. And lastly, with that slide, I want to say get connected, stay connected, and Swadi Kahap.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sunil. I think, let there be light everywhere is a very powerful image and ambition, and we'll begin to examine how we might be able to achieve that in the panel, which is coming up shortly. But just before the panel, I'd like to welcome on screen Dr. Sonyang Tang, Chief Scientist from China Unicom.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Tan Xiongyan from China Unicom. It's my pleasure to deliver a speech here. My topic is jointly promoting 5G advanced for the prosperity of the broadband industry. In February 2020, ETSI officially released the 5G, proposing the industry vision of fiber to everywhere. With 10G-PON, Wi-Fi 6, and the sync wavelengths 200 gigabits per second plus OXC as core technologies, ETSI defined the generation of fixed network for the first time. Once proposed, the 5G standard and its vision quickly attracted wide attention in the industry. After more than 2 years of efforts, 5G has achieved rapid development from standards to massive deployment and applications. Today, ETSI 5G ISG has nearly 100 members. The establishment of WBBA marks the new beginning for 5G industry development. In March 2021, China government released the Dual Gigabit Network Collaborative Development Action Plan to systematically promote the construction of mobile 5G and fixed 5G. As one of the dominant telecom operators in China, China Unicom actively responded to the government policy. 2 years ago, China Unicom released the Smart Home brand and launched the 3 gigabit access service package. That is the combination of the mobile gigabits, optic gigabits, and the Wi-Fi gigabits. Guided by China Unicom's network transformation strategy, CoverNet, we constructed optic private networks and provided premium private lines for financial, enterprise, and government customers. China Unicom also make great efforts to promote the applications of the 5G technologies in vertical industries. We can say that the 5G industry ecosystem is now in full swing. Today, we see some new industry trends which drive the further evolution of optic network. We think that the 5G advanced phase is coming. Firstly, to home, with the emergence of the metaverse, fiber optics need to connect the real world with the virtual world. And the access bandwidth needs to evolve from 1 gigabit per second to 10 gigabits per second. Secondly, to enterprise, the network capabilities need to evolve from carrier grid to industrial grid, which means microsecond level latency and 6-9 reliability. Thirdly, to computing, we need a flexible and agile optic network, which not only provide a hyperscale data center interconnection, but also a large number of edge computing interconnections. Finally, for green and energy saving, optic networks are moving toward greener, improving energy efficiency by 10 times. So 5G advanced need to meet diverse service requirements. In September this year, ETSI released the 5G advanced standard white paper, which describes the driving forces, scenarios, and the key technologies of the 5G advanced and defines new objectives and capabilities for future fixed broadband development. It is expected that in the year 2023, the first version of 5G advanced standard will be defined. On the industrial side, 5G advanced features are continuously expanded to meet the requirements of new scenarios. 3 new features are added. Green and agile optic network, GAO, improve energy efficiency by 10 times. Real-time resilient link, RRL, providing microsecond level latency and 6-9 reliability to meet the industrial grid requirements. Optic sensing and visualization, OSV, realizing convergence of optic communication and optic sensing. In addition, the EIPB full fiber connection FFC and the guaranteed reliable experience GRE capabilities need to be further enhanced. To meet the new service requirements of connections at home, enterprise, and the computing power scenarios, the end-to-end all-optic-based targeted network architecture needs to be consolidated. For home scenarios, Fiber to the Room FTTR provides premium connections for smart homes, and the OLT plus OTN integrated edge computing to reduce latency and improve user experience. For the enterprise scenarios, for larger enterprises, F5G Advanced provides point-to-point OSU OTN connections to ensure reliability and security. For small and medium-sized enterprises, F5G Advanced provides PAM plus OTN private lines to optimize latency, improve quality. Based on the industrial-grade optic networks, microsecond level latency and 6.9 ultra-high reliability are provided to enable smart manufacturing. For the computing power interconnection scenarios, the optic anchor is upgraded to computing anchor, which is 300 meters close to users, implementing one-hop computing. The latency from the optic anchor to edge data center within a city is less than 1 millisecond. To provincial data center is less than 5 milliseconds, and to regional data center is less than 20 milliseconds. Home broadband has evolved from the fiber to the home FTTH, which just provides home with one optic fiber, to fiber to the room FTTR, which provides home with one optic network. FTTH has laid the foundation for all optic homes. As the broadband access upgraded to 500 megabits per second to 1 gigabits per second, high-value services such as 4K, 8K, VR, smart home, online office, online education, and live streaming emerging. China Unicom takes the lead in building star-standard broadband home by providing 10G-PON-based FTTR to enable users to enjoy gigabit experience on one home network. In the future, diversified immersive live and production services such as XR, 8K video, cloud gaming, and healthcare will emerge, requiring higher quality of the service experience. So the network bandwidths need to continuous upgrade to 15G PON and Wi-Fi 7 to provide much higher bandwidth access and home IoT interconnections. Enterprise and manufacturing digitalization is picking up speed. In office, school, and hospital scenarios, XR is widely used. Data is migrated to the cloud, and the cross-range intelligent collaboration gradually becomes the mainstream, such as remote diagnosis and treatment in hospitals, smart teaching in schools, and the online office. With the development of the smart industry, 3D machine vision, cloud-based PLC, and the centralized control are gradually deployed in manufacturing sector, posing higher requirements on network reliability, bandwidth, and latency. F5G Advanced uses new capabilities such as 15G PON-based FTTO, FTTM, fiber to the machine, and Wi-Fi 7 to achieve the seamless broadband coverage of the 1 to 10 gigabits per second, and the microsecond level deterministic latency, building the optic base for industry internet. In the year 2021, China government launched the Eastern Data Western Computing Project, which will send data from the more prosperous eastern regions of China to the less developed but resource-rich western region for storage and computing. To support this national project, it's very important to optimize the interconnection network between the eastern and the western region, and provide direction connections between these national computing hub nodes. All optic networks will play a key role, which could help build a low latency transmission cycle, 20 milliseconds between hubs, 5 milliseconds within hubs, and 1 millisecond from user to edge computing services. Green and low carbon development has become a global consensus. With the digitalization of society and the industries, network capacity requirements are increasing rapidly, and the energy efficiency improvement is imperative. As the greenest transmission solution, the end-to-end optic network can significantly reduce energy consumption, making network greener. For the all-optic network, energy efficiency can be further improved from 3 perspectives. First is green architecture. The all-optic OXC technology is used to optimize the traditional ROADM architecture. The sync side space could be reduced by 19%, and the power consumption could be reduced by more than 16%. By further increasing the line rate, the power consumption per bit will decrease significantly. Second is green side. Traditional SDH upgrading to OTN can greatly reduce space usage and improve energy efficiency. The innovative OSU technology can further greatly improve network resource utilization. The third is green operation. The intelligent energy-saving operation and management is introduced to dynamically adjust device power consumption based on the actual network traffic. After 5 years of the efforts, China Unicom's CoBaNet 2.0 network transformation toward cloud and network convergence has made great progress. In the area of the new digital economy, China Unicom released the CoBaNet 3.0 strategy in March 2021 to comprehensively define the next generation digital infrastructure, integrated connection, computing, intelligence, and sensing. Aligning with the evolution of the F5G Advanced, the all-optic base has become the most important part of China Unicom's CoBaNet 3.0 next generation network infrastructure. In May this year, China Unicom released the white paper on all-optic base in the computing area, which defines the network architecture and the features of the all-optic base in accordance with the vision of the F5G Advanced. China Unicom's all-optic network for the national project Eastern Data Western Computing was also officially launched. The fixed broadband intergenerational evolution to F5G Advanced has begun. China Unicom and more than 20 industry partners around the world jointly finished the F5G Advanced industry white paper. This white paper clarifies the industry vision of 5G Advanced. That's 10G to everywhere, OTN to every site, industrial grid, autonomous network, and the integrated communication and the sensing. It discussed the F5G Advanced network architecture, technical feature enhancements, and the key capability evolution in 4 scenarios: home, enterprise, computing power interconnection, and the green optic base. It aims to provide reference scenario requirements and the technical directions for F5G Advanced, provide guidance for the network deployment and evolution, and build consensus in the industry to jointly promote fixed broadband evolution. Here, China Unicom proposes to build a 5G advanced industry consensus, accelerate standard formulation, construct leading all-optic networks, promote 5G advanced technologies forward, and jointly open a new area of ultra broadband world. Thanks for your attention.
Just to set the scene for some of the conversation that we'll have up here, I think one of the things that's coming across loud and clear through the course of today's presentations, every market within every region is at different stages of maturity. What that does is it means that there are different business priorities, different enterprise and consumer pressures, different socio-economic ambitions in each of those different markets. But there are some common threads and themes that run across them. And that's what we'll seek to examine in this upcoming panel conversation, where we look at some of the existing success stories, but also some of the strategies which can drive forward broadband industry development. I'd like to introduce on the stage to join me for the panel my colleagues Sunil, Daniel and Vishesh. Thank you everybody for joining us on stage here today. I think let's start with a round of introductions. If I can just also say for those in the audience, we are going to welcome questions throughout the course of today's discussion. So please do raise your hand and one of my colleagues will bring across a microphone if you have a comment to make or a question to pose to one of our panelists. But maybe in the course of starting those introductions, Daniel, if we start at your end of the row.
My name is Daniel Tang. I'm from Huawei's data communication product line. I look after the technology strategies for data communication network. Because as we all know, people need ultra broadband to deliver high-speed internet. So on top of the physical bandwidth, we also need to deliver next generation internet service, particularly based on IPv6 protocols.
Thank you, Daniel. Vishesh, if I pass to you.
My name is Vishesh Gupta. I'm not as technically evolved as most of my panelists, but I'm from the banking community. So I sort of run the Asia TMT healthcare and consumer sector banking business for SMBC, based out of Singapore. Have been predominantly a TMT banker throughout my career, and what we do is effectively sort of help finance some of the asset classes we've been talking about. And obviously sort of, the finance looks at both the debt and the equity elements of it.
Thanks, Vishesh. And Sunil, for anybody who's joined us since your presentation, do you want to reintroduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Sunil Pyarlao from OpenServe South Africa. OpenServe is a wholesale open access network services provider, and I'm an executive responsible for the network architecture and modeling. But I'll try and avoid any technical jargon. I'll try and keep it without technical provision.
Let's see if we can hold you to that. I think what you'll see here across, of course, is that we've got a range of backgrounds and perspectives. Hopefully that will bring to the panel, from the investment community, vendor and also operator community. I think just to get us started, just to kind of bring to the surface one of the macro trends that we've been discussing across the course of this afternoon, this fact that connectivity is the absolutely critical driving force for the digital economy, and connectivity for all is the ultimate ambition. What does that mean in terms of driving regional development? I wonder if anybody wants to get us started there.
Sure. So I think, the way at least I look at it, and especially I think the world has changed pretty much pre the pandemic and post the pandemic, right? There were a lot of advanced use cases which were under development, sort of autonomous vehicles, connected machines, and so on and so forth. But the way I see this is, the most basic requirements of education, doing your daily jobs, they have to a large extent, or at least to some extent, moved online. Right? Any organization that we see, and I know I'm making a very broad generalization, but to a large degree, people are actually spending a lot of time working from home or working remotely. And I think, to me, being connected doesn't just stop there. Your healthcare services, right? This is all sort of the basics and the essentials. Again, we can go into the more futuristic sort of use cases as well. But I think where Asia is, at least the basics being addressed is what probably will drive a lot of the near-term acceleration in demand. And then, things which are a little more evolved will happen, further down the line.
Absolutely. I think COVID certainly made more acute the fact that broadband is part of our critical national infrastructure just for living our daily lives, even without considering the kind of the use cases and applications of the future. When we think about, those increased demands, that's going to put, or is already putting, a lot of pressure on the IP network, which is, a fundamental enabler for our broadband infrastructure. How important is, this concept of IP on everything? Daniel, I wonder if you have a view.
As we discussed earlier, together, there are already a lot of people almost live on the internet every day. So I think when we say ultra broadband for everyone, it's also about internet service to everything. But the challenge today is shortage of IP address due to the limitation of IPv4, basically the internet protocol based on version 4. That's why we work together with IETF, the standard organization, to drive the adoption of IPv6 based implementations. Maybe you have seen some very impressive fiber broadband numbers in China, but similarly, even more impressive is the progress of the IPv6 adoption ratio in China has significantly increased from down to less than 10% to more or less 60% at the end of last year. So this is really quite some progress. I think just like government plays a very important role to accelerate adoption of fiber, the adoption of IPv6 also needs a lot of regulation initiative to drive things forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think where we see the government take the lead from a policy perspective, the industry in that territory then gets behind and adopts more quickly the IPv6 protocol.
Yes, and also I think, of course, the government's own IT spending is also very important here.
Absolutely. I think that might be a topic that we come back to later on in the conversation. Yes. If you think about broadband specifically, how do we feel like we're progressing as an industry towards this concept of ubiquitous broadband? We've seen lots of data points in terms of connectivity trends. I mean, Sunil, I'll start with you because you showed that very fascinating map of how far the light spreads across the African continent. If you take a kind of a global view, how do you think we're doing in that progress towards ubiquitous broadband?
Yeah, ubiquitous broadband is an interesting subject, Mark. We have ubiquity. We definitely have ubiquity, but where do we have it? We have it where the telcos can get the highest ARPU, where you can get the best return on investment. So we have ubiquity in metropolitan areas. And as you move out of the metropolitan, I think ubiquity disappears totally. I used the concept of light earlier on to demonstrate omnipresence. And I think it's not just about connectivity, it's access to internet, access to not just fiber, but access to any form of broadband connectivity is non-existent in many rural parts, many suburban parts. Where Daniel and I were talking earlier on as well. He's got some interesting stats across the world where people don't have access to basic connectivity. So talking about ubiquity, yes, it does exist, but it does not exist all over. It exists in metropolitan areas where you have many operators overbuilding each other. And again, totally related to return on investment. And we need to look at other funding models, which I'm sure my colleague from the bank will talk about how we can fund the deployment of not just fiber, but deployment of broadband in general.
Okay, good. So let's kind of expand on that now then. So we've got this degree of ubiquity in metro areas, but that is not something which is necessarily nationwide. How do we go about filling that gap? What needs to happen for us to spread the light?
So I think just from a sort of funding standpoint, right? And I think where there's light, that's where the money goes, or it's vice versa as well. What at least I've seen, and again, I'd sort of look at digital infrastructure as one bucket of infrastructure for telecoms, right? There's been a lot of progress on certain sectors. Towers, for an example, was at a place 15 years ago where we were probably having similar conversations, or 20 years ago, right? Again, data centers, although not exactly related, but it forms part of the network and the computing. Again, there's a lot of work being done there. Now, broadband as a service has existed probably for the longest time. I mean, pretty much as in line with when we had sort of wireless. But what I haven't seen, at least in Asia, is real investment going into the parts which were underserved many years ago. Yes, the bucket has sort of increased, but you'd be surprised, amongst the most developed nations in Asia, there are still pockets where there's no broadband connectivity. It's just the terrain, and it's where the houses are, and the density. I think, again, this is a very difficult question to answer, because there's no sort of magic around it. But ultimately, I think, to me, the biggest thing here is that we've got to start looking at broadband-based returns from a slightly broader angle. It cannot just be, that ARPU that you get from the X subscribers that you get from that part of the world or that part of a specific country. That may not work in areas with low population density and where the affordability is not really there. I think it has to be looked at as a combination of what can be achieved from that internet. I recall sort of, Martin pointed out to some of the stats there. To me, the unconnected, we need to see what happens when they're connected and what's the value that can be generated out of it. If it's just about that X number of subscribers on that Y ARPU, in a lot of instances, I think that return may just not work.
So on top of funding, I think we also can achieve a lot of saving. For example, you have seen that China has a huge penetration in terms of fiber broadband. One way they have smartly managed to achieve that target is combining the infrastructure rollout of motorways together with the fiber rollout. And also because every year there are so many new apartment buildings being sold out in China. So those apartment buildings have fiber to the home already embedded. So that means it does not need telco to do another round of home visit to rewire the home with fiber. So I think this is a very good example. Similarly, how we have advanced IPv6 penetration so significantly. The reason being that when people getting new smartphones every year, especially when we roll out the 5G network, all the new 4G and 5G smartphones have IPv6 enabled, turned on by default. So people are not even aware of this fact, but secretly they already are an active IPv6 user now. So I think by combining upgrade of different infrastructure together, physical infrastructure or IP infrastructure, it can save a lot of money.
Digital infrastructure by design.
Yes, designed with advanced architecture.
Yeah. Okay, very good. If we then kind of just kind of turn our gaze to where connectivity does already exist, and we saw incredible spikes in terms of bandwidth demand during the COVID periods. We haven't gone back to kind of pre-COVID levels of bandwidth demand. Those have remained. Given that changing landscape, what are some of the technology priorities that the industry should be considering in order to kind of keep up with and harness that demand?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, Mark, because the pandemic has taught us a lot of things. It showed us that bandwidth demand can increase. But more importantly, what it taught us is that if you provide the ability to connect, that ability doesn't disappear. So once connected, people stay connected. They want to be connected. So we've seen a big increase in bandwidth demand because of the need to connect. But that demand did not disappear when the pandemic disappeared. So that's the first interesting part. And then you were talking about technology evolution. Vishesh and Danielle both spoke about the efficiencies of fiber network. So you roll out a network and you change the technology. And technology is forever evolving. It's changing really every few years. You see a new technology come out. And if you have a very robust, very efficient fiber network out there, that investment is a sound investment. You just continue upgrading technology. But I think what becomes difficult is that digital divide that I always speak about gets bigger and bigger. Because you're moving from GPON to XGS-PON to 50 gig PON to 100 gig PON on your existing networks. But we need to see that network expand further. We need to see that while building and changing technology, that we also expand our fiber footprint at a similar pace.
Yeah, and again, to Sunil's point, and while we were chatting earlier, I think I was frankly fairly surprised when Sunil mentioned that there are probably around 40 sort of network providers or fixed line network providers in South Africa, and not the entire country, but places where people want to be, dense urban areas. It's not that investments haven't gone in and people aren't people are looking at technology advancements as well, and again, but it's all concentrated in the areas which were already well served. The question is, how does that get well spread across, right? And again, as I said, there's no magic answer to it. Ultimately, if the affordability is not there, or just the density is not there, for lack of a better word, the investment in some of the other parts have to be subsidized by either returns from the more dense areas, or governments sort of coming in, stepping in, and sort of looking at the greater good, and probably a combination of the other, and not ancillary but value-added services around it, right? Which ultimately drive returns for the overall sector. The sector, I think, fixed broadband and generally broadband has been looked at as a very siloed sector, right? It's not been connected to, in terms of investments, to what is out there. Subsea has been, right? You see a lot of subsea cable investments by corporations, but you don't see terrestrial fiber linked investments. You don't see partnerships and JVs forming where a big social media enterprise might say, look, I'm gonna take a certain amount of stake in a company and roll out broadband in this part of a certain country where I may just get access to 50 million subscribers, right? And that's just not for them, that's for everybody else as well. But I guess the puzzle cannot be solved by one or two parties. It's a mesh.
And what would need to happen for that model to change in that way that you're describing, do you think?
So I think, again, there could be various ways to sort of slice the pie, but one of the things around this is either it's a government-led model where network is centralized. And again, for South Africa, the 40 lines are already there. You can't do much about that right now. But if you have a couple of lines or 3 or 4 lines in metro areas in a certain country, I think we should avoid making that from 3 to 40, right? That investment can go into rural areas. But the problem with that is if it's a new enterprise, trying to go into that part of a certain country, returns are always a challenge, right? And I've never seen, we've seen sort of use cases come to us, we've seen transactions come to us, but to be frank and honest, it's been difficult to get to fruition, right? I think one of the things is if you either centralize the network, and that network then has to be effectively utilized by all sort of ISPs and providers, and that in the end is also incentivized to go roll out into the rural parts. But again, there is an element of subsidizing here, right? Because you make returns here and they are invested somewhere there, which is somewhat like the USO model in wireless, which had a good impact, I guess. I think the other way to look at this could also be if governments step in and sort of look at the greater good around this. But to me, one of the challenges with that will always be for how much and for how long, right? If you're running a completely rural area-based broadband network, again, the affordability, the uptake, just the pure reach and the dollar return on that investment may not really work. So it has to be linked through something else, which can be then partnerships coming from the ultimate value-added service providers, right? I see these two as sort of broad frameworks. Again, there could be many others.
Great.
Well, my personal take is maybe start with some business or enterprise service first, because these are people who are likely to develop more advanced application on top of fiber broadband, and they are willing to pay more for that. So either for small or medium business, I think this is also a viable approach. So this way we can get, let's say, 2 kind of returns on the fiber broadband. One is the consumer, the residential market, which is difficult in the rural area. But if there are small business or large companies in the rural areas, I think they also need the fiber. So that's why now we're looking at how to enhance the monetization capability of fiber broadband in the enterprise market so that we can offer not just connectivity, but also other value-added service to those customers. This way, telcos can have more revenue back. If you look at the history of the PSTN development, in the early days, it's mainly been adopted first wave by the business companies or other people who need this for work, rather than using it to call your home, call your mom, right?
Yep.
So I think maybe starting with some of the more business-oriented approach can also help to accelerate return on investment. Yeah.
And Sunil, when we think about making that business case for faster returns on investment from your own personal perspective, would you agree with the points there that Daniel's making?
Yeah, I think Daniel and Vishesh have both raised very interesting points. And Vishesh and I were chatting earlier about how Singtel has done it in Singapore. Now, let's look at South Africa as a unique example where we have up to 40 different fiber network operators, all chasing for the same land grab, all chasing for metros. And I think if there was some form of regulation, like Vishesh has mentioned with the mobile operators in the early 90s, there was the universal services obligation model. And if government can intervene and say, with all of this overbuild, you're having 4 or 5 networks built over each other, chasing the same ARPU in the same region. And therefore, when we talk about ubiquity, we say we have enough connectivity in the metros. Can we not regulate the way we roll out fiber? And one operator roll out in an area and sell a wholesale network and spread that 40 operators. Other parts of the world, like Spain, has 1 or 2 operators. Singtel has 1. Yeah. But there are parts of the world that have up to 4 to 5 network operators. Yep. And globally, I think if we start to pool our resources, we can very, very easily bridge this digital divide that we all talk about. We can very easily get the fiber out to the places and share that cost to deploy fiber, because that is the most expensive part. Your last mile fiber costs you the most.
Yep.
Deploying, your active equipment costs you roughly about $20 to $30 per user. The rest of your $250 to $500 actually is for the fiber rollout, your last mile rollout. So that is the most expensive part. And from a financing perspective, yes, investment's difficult in areas that you're not going to get good ARPU, that you're not going to get good returns on investment. But if you pull your resources and like Vishesh said, start cross-subsidizing,
yes,
you start getting better economies of scale.
And if you think of say, an underserved or an unserved region, right? And if you think of private capital, both debt and equity, people can take a view around, I think that there's enough available and there's enough sort of research that can be done around the costs involved of rolling out, what the service can be offered at. I think where private capital would probably sort of, struggle a little bit is on the question of, so I'm going and funding the number 2 guy and maybe funding the number 3 guy, but what happens when the number 4 and the number 5 and the 6 and the 7 come in, right? Mm-hmm. And who sort of stops that? So that's been a big challenge, and we've seen in some countries on the wireless side as well, and many markets in Asia, huge population bases have gone from 12, 13 wireless operators to 2 or 3 now. And again, you could keep rolling out. If there is some level of regulation around the number of people who can, first of all, the number of people who can do this, right? Pure hard infrastructure. I think then that infrastructure can become financeable for both banks and equity providers, right? Because again, people like certainty in this space. Yeah. Banks more, equity guys less, because they go for the returns. But in the absence of certainty, or at least a semblance of certainty, financing these vehicles becomes very difficult. And hence they have historically been largely financed by existing sort of organizations like telcos, or in some cases governments.
If we just continue on that for a moment then. So certainty is important from your perspective. We've been talking about, fiber to the home, IP evolution. These present great opportunities, but obviously they require significant investment. Aside from the certainty characteristic, what are the other market conditions that need to exist to make it attractive for investment?
So I think if I were to just list down 4 or 5 key attributes when sort of, I guess, and again, this is me sort of putting on both the equity and the debt hats.
Sure.
Somebody would look at when a call it a greenfield projects comes to them, right? One would be, what is the cost of rolling out there, right? What is the sort of population density, or call it house density? Normally, you would expect there to be 1 sort of broadband line in a house. Maybe in some cases there are 2. So what's the density? What does it mean to roll out a network here? Again, there could be detailed surveys done, and people would have a sense as to if they were offering the service at a certain price, what could be the take-up, right? Yeah. Again, you can be off by a certain amount, but you'll at least get a decent sense on what's my cost or what's my capex and what's my revenue potential here. I think beyond that, what you need to see is, how the OpEx pans out. Again, there are existing businesses around it, right? That can all be modeled. To me, the trick to the equation is that whole 3 to 40, right? I launch today, I fund something today, 2 other people come in, slash prices by 30%. My sort of ARPU assumption on a certain amount of bandwidth, there's a toss up to the air, right? I mean, there's nothing behind them. So to me, when these projects come to the market, to the extent there is contracted visibility, that'll be good. If governments can back these up, and again, that's not equity backing, right? That's basically saying we believe in this part of our country, you'll get these many subscribers. It could be in the form of PPP, and again, I saw a mention of that, or it could be certain level of market risk. Now, equity guys are more prone to taking market risk than banks, but for the right business model, there have been deals done with market risk as well. Right structures, right sort of bells and whistles around it.
Great. And sorry, Sunil.
Go for it. I just want to say that Daniel also raised a very important point about enterprise connectivity.
Yeah.
So, most of these towns, these smaller towns, have business presence. And the business case can actually come from providing connectivity to these enterprises. Because like he rightfully mentioned, enterprise connectivity brings you higher revenues for the very same infrastructure that you rolled out. And Daniel, I don't know if you can expand on that, but that actually gives you an opportunity. First, gives you firstly the business case to roll out the infrastructure, and secondly, provides you with the opportunity to connect the surrounding community.
Yeah, I think we can take a more holistic approach looking at investment to serve both residential market, even back of the mobile base stations and those business customers. Maybe you can only invest for one set of network infrastructure to serve 3 markets together. Then all you need to do is on-demandly connect each and every home who take up to the fiber broadband, right? So I think that there's huge space for us to use this kind of synergy between different business to save a lot of extra cost.
Absolutely. And Daniel, you mentioned earlier about that then creates the opportunity for value-added services. If we think about the services, applications, devices of the future that are going to drive the kind of demand which is going to stimulate investment, what's the panel's sense of what those services, applications, devices might be?
Well, I think there are a lot of potentials. But as we debated together with Vinesh at lunch, that telcos are not the most capable of delivering those very fancy applications. However, it does have a fundamental advantage is everyone will need the connectivity. So what they can do is, first, on top of the basic connectivity service, they can upsell other applications. Yeah. Either the homegrown telco-developed applications, like in Africa, for example, the mobile payment is very successful. So it's a homegrown payment service offered by telcos, right? So you could do the same for the fixed broadband. But at the same time, I believe telco can also upsell as a channel those value-added service. Maybe some kind of innovation from metaverse, from Facebook, from other companies, not just for the residential applications, but also for the business applications. I know quite a number of big telco operators. They serve as what they call a cloud service broker for Azure from Microsoft or Amazon Web Service from Amazon. Yeah. So this way, I think it can have more diversified offerings and therefore have more, let's say, revenue streams coming back for basic connectivity, for homegrown telco applications, and also as a broker distribution channel fee for those other applications. Yeah.
I think from my standpoint, and I look at this a little more simplistically, and again, completely sort of agree with the points made by Daniel. But if we look at the near term, right, again, just with COVID, households saw and the world saw the number of broadband users drastically increase. That fixed line Wi-Fi that was running around in your house was largely not used by children, right? Kids didn't have access to it. Now they all have a device because they need to take their lessons. They have an iPad or they have a laptop. and again, they use simple services there. They would go to the, sort of the school's website or whatever mediums they use. But beyond that, I think just with the simpler applications of today, which is social networking, online video, your Netflixes of the world, and so on and so forth, I think the amount of bandwidth that requires now, to me, that's an opportunity itself. There are, again, a lot more advanced use cases which will certainly happen. Autonomous vehicles. It'll take some time for people to trust that, right? I'm not sure if you were told today that going out, there'll be 3 sort of autonomous vehicles driving out, I'm not sure how many people will take the train from here. That's to be seen. So to me, connected devices, autonomous vehicles, these are all good long-term use cases. But the fact of the matter is, when COVID hit and people were locked down, there was shortage of devices, networks were down, there was pressure on networks, and that demand has not gone back. Somehow, magically, people are still consuming that amount of data. Right? So to me, that near-term solution is very important. And it's not just entertainment now. It's your livelihood. It's education. It's healthcare, right?
Maybe just to add to the perception of demand, Mark, there's the perception that demand's exceeding supply. But let's look at the world average of connectivity. You're sitting at about 30 to 35% connectivity with any fiber network operator. OpenServe's among the highest in the world with 46%, which tells me that we got about 60 to 70% of our network unconnected. Yep. In other words, supply exceeds demand. But to Vishesh's point, the demand is there, but the demand is not where we have the supply. And that's the big difference. Where we have the supply, where we've passed the homes, we have an excess of supply. The demand is actually where we haven't gone. And that's a balance we need to try to get. So the perception that there's more demand than supply, the demand is not in the metro areas. The metro areas are oversaturated. We've passed more homes there than we can actually connect. And that's just to put the whole demand-supply conversation into perspective.
So it goes back to that ubiquity
Yeah.
point earlier on. It's about making sure that we map ubiquity of supply with ubiquity of demand.
100%. Perfect.
Just to try and bring a few of the threads together in kind of just the last 9 minutes or so here. We've heard across the course of the last few days quite rightly about the importance and the focus on performance. But how as an industry do you think we are doing in terms of delivering on our sustainability and affordability goals?
I'll probably touch upon the affordability part first. And again, that's it's slightly ironic where these services can be appropriately charged for versus where you need to go. The problem is just given how the investment returns would work out, you need to charge a lot higher in less dense areas, right? It's simple math. Yeah. And that's where it just kills the affordability. In dense urban areas, you can probably relatively charge a little less, but that's where people can afford it and pay for it, right? So to me, in terms of affordability, again, certain countries in Asia, again, I have a slide on that, probably not exactly affordability, but talks about ARPUs. I think again, there's probably a wider spread, and it's a function of how many alternatives you have, what's the market dynamic and structure like. And sort of Tsuka-san was also referring to it in her presentation that most nations are actually below that 2% mark with sort of, that deteriorating a little bit. But to me, I think, how do we look at affordability, right? Affordability, if you raise prices by, I was just looking at my phone, and the price for one of my subscription services has been increased by 10%. They just told me, right, that this is going to go up. If you want to cancel, you can cancel. But how do we look at affordability? To me, the real metric that should be looked at is how can this be provided in areas where people will struggle to sort of, pay $20 a month for broadband, right? And how does that gel with where you're providing the service now?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you,
so
Daniel.
For us, it's all about how to use technology innovations to structurally reduce the total cost of ownership for the telcos. So total cost of ownership, you can split into two parts. One is CapEx, one is OpEx. On the CapEx part, we do see great opportunities to find synergies between the 2B business, 2C business, and 2Home business. So today, we're more or less like, for every village, we're building 3 motorways in parallel, right? One for business, one for homes, one for the radio towers for 5G. But why not combine that into one road, slightly wider, but with lanes very clearly marked, and maybe even bus lanes, dedicated for the business customers or for the mobile backhaul. So this way, I think we can save a lot of both CapEx and OpEx. Now, the other thing about OpEx, by the way, the technology we talked about earlier is called slicing. People know about 5G slicing, but similarly in IP network and optical network, you can also do slicing.
Yep.
Now, the other thing is about reducing the OpEx. As the network grows bigger and bigger, we can no longer afford to have human-based operation model. It's like imagine you have a traffic police standing at every red light or every crossroad, right? Direct traffic. It's not possible. So that's why we're having this new approach. We call it autonomous network, where you can have really using what we call the data-driven autonomous network operation, leveraging advanced big data analytics and AI-based forecast of the traffic. So this way we can basically rely on the algorithms instead of human labors to manage the network, to direct the traffic. And also because this way we can also do what we say increasing the level of visibility of energy consumption. So in the long term, it's also going to make the network more sustainable, less carbon footprint.
And if we build on that final comment there, Daniel, and we think about not just the sustainability of the telco, but what broadband can enable from a sustainability in wider society, I wonder, any thoughts, comments from OpenServe, Sunil?
Yeah, so just before I go there, I want to add on to what Daniel has said. He's made a very good point, and I like the analogy that he used of several highways leading to a small town. There's this mistrust in PON network. There's the mistrust from backhaul consumers that a shared network is not a secure network. And I think we need to understand that the security is actually built in your active equipment, not in your shared network. And the more we start selling that concept that a shared network is still a very secure network. I mean, we've got parts of the world using the shared network for their banking facilities, which is probably one of the most secure facilities. So piggybacking on that statement, Daniel, you can get a lot of efficiencies from, you spoke about slicing, but before we go to slicing, just on the aggregation level, we're still seeing Metro Ethernet aggregation devices being used. So point-to-point connection. Again, one highway for every connection. You can share that with a passive network. Just put on a splitter and you can provide 5 or 6 operators service from the one fiber. So I think there's a lot of efficiencies we can get. It's just a mindset shift that we need to move. We need to move from the all copper-based mindset to a fiber-based mindset, that a fiber can give you different lambdas of light, and you can split that lambda of light, and each lambda is actually a secure lambda. And I think educating the industry on that, educating the consumers on that is important.
Yeah, totally agree.
I think there's a lot of mindset shifting and education required across all of the points that we've been discussing here today. And that's one of the kind of the primary goals of the World Broadband Association as a group. Unless there are any questions or comments from the audience, we have one here. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, excellent, really interesting panel discussion. I found it very, very insightful. Just on because one of the topics I'm really interested in is innovative rationales for how we fund the different parts of the rollout of next generation broadband. And maybe 2 comments, and maybe people could suggest on them. One is about regulation, right? Since I've been in the industry since the mid-80s, and one of the golden mantras of regulation has been more competition is better for the consumer. And so, most countries started off with 1 supplier, and then, 2 is better than 1, gives you choice, and 3 is better than 2, it gives you choice, and so on. But what I'm hearing from the panel is that thinking only goes so far, and it is broken particularly around the whole concept of bearing the the cost of rolling out next generation broadband. And so that's a very serious discussion to be had with regulators. And it's not just from this panel, I've heard it from many other conversations, that we need to have a serious look at when is too much competition starting to be negative for the consumer. The second point is about government role in this and government funding. And ultimately, countries do go down the road of government funding, of maybe a shared broadband network with them, maybe the last mile funded commercially and so on. Nothing is perfect that's out there. But one of the things I'm really interested in, if we really believe in the argument that rolling out broadband, rolling out fibre into these lesser served communities where it's hard to make a business case, if we really believe that argument, that does grow GDP, is there merit in exploring with governments a model where there's almost like a back-ended subvention based on, as the GDP does grow, as the wealth in those areas does grow, there is a government funding back to the operators. So maybe the operators and their financial partners are funding it front-ended, but then in these public-private partnerships over a 20-year, 30-year basis, start getting a claw back from the government based on growth of GDP or growth of wealth in those particular regions. And that might be a more palatable and also create a positive feedback loop in terms of wanting to see the growth from those areas. So those are just two comments, but really excellent panel.
Thank you, Martin. I mean, on that kind of PPP model,
and Martin, frankly, excellent comments. I think on the first part, right, that's been the case for most things that we see. Now, again, there are ways to slice that as well. To Daniel's point, there's the CapEx piece and there's the OpEx piece as well. The CapEx piece is basically laying down the fiber, right? I mean, from ground up in most of these places, there's practically not much today. Now, as long as that it can be sort of, I guess, centralized, and people are not effectively looking at one now and sort of 40, I keep coming back to that, 10 years from now, there can at least be certain level of certainty there. Now, beyond that, how you sell that capacity, that is where you can have competition, because that's where service quality matters. The number of people doing it matters. But a big piece of the investment, a big piece of the cost is actually that hard infrastructure. And that can be relatively easier financed if there was certainty, at least around the first part, right? That, this is being done today, and there'll be a lot of people trying to sell from this, but not too many trying to build parallel pipes. So that's I mean, you can still have healthy competition at the ultimate delivery and not at the start.
I think right now we are in a big cycle where huge investment into fiber infrastructure is needed. So I totally agree with Martin's word that we do need a investment-friendly regulation environment here.
I mean, one of the things to probably refer to is a satellite PPP that recently happened in Indonesia. It's the end use is for a lot of government enterprises, but again, I'm sure in all these parts, and whichever government we are looking at, that could be a pocket of use. And if that can be in a way contracted at the start, which leads somewhat of a starting base, right, an anchor to the project. On top of that is the commercial layer. Sorry.
Just
a closing remark on that. Martin's stimulated a conversation that we can talk about the entire afternoon.
Yes.
But the balance between when is too much of competition detrimental to the market. So South Africa was one of the most expensive places for broadband in the past, and that price of broadband has dropped significantly due to competition. But what we must be careful is that you don't want too much of competition that it drives the cost of broadband down so much that the focus on land grab is only in certain areas.
Yes.
That everyone's chasing high ARPU and not chasing investment in other areas because the cost to provide service has been really driven down by too much competition. So absolutely agree with both Vishesh, Daniel, and with Martin that competition is healthy. It helps to drop the price down, but you need to get a balance between where too much of competition is going to avoid
investment in certain pockets of the market. Thank
Agreed.
you,
So
Mark.
finding that balance will help us to kind of spread the light, going back to your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope you just join me in thanking our three panelists for this fantastic conversation, Daniel, Vishesh, and Sunil. And I'd like to invite Vishesh just to stay with us on stage so that he can deliver his keynote presentation.
Thank you, everybody. Again, I'd like to thank the audience for being sort of so patient on a Friday evening, pretty much getting close to an evening. Again, just a quick introduction. My name is Vishesh Gupta. I head up sector banking for Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. We are a bank, very active in the TMT space across across APAC and probably globally as well. My presentation would be slightly focusing on slightly different aspects of broadband and more around the the funding and the investments aspect of it. And while we can get bogged down with technology, bankers can also bog us down with numbers. I've tried to cut down on some of the numbers as much as I can. It'll still be numbers heavy, so please bear with me. When I was looking at what to do and how to address the question here, the first thing that came to mind was, what is broadband? And frankly, I did a fair bit of Googling around that. And I didn't get to a single ubiquitous answer, right? Broadband is defined in many ways. What I've at least tried to do here is focus a little bit more on the fixed broadband aspect of things. Again, a good quality 4G network can provide you broadband speeds. It can also be about the ultimate end use, what it can enable. There are various definitions around it. So the presentation is a little more focused around fixed broadband and looks at more, call it where fixed broadband and in general broadband is in Asia today, rather than getting to a conclusion and leaving some food for thought. So if you look at this slide and the chart on the left, it's effectively broadband household penetration, ARPU, on the x-axis. The radius of the circle effectively denotes the dollar value of fixed broadband revenues in that country. Now again, stats are hard to come by in this sector, so this may not exactly gel with what we saw earlier, but broadly in line, I'd say. And again, I'll just leave a few messages, a few very simple messages here, right? Sorry, I don't have this working. So if you look at India, for an example, I guess the most populous country in Asia and globally, and look at the size of their circle. If it was to move any further up the curve, right, that circle would pretty much fill that left part, right? That's the opportunity we are talking about. Again, if we look at a country like Indonesia as well, tiny in this space, right, as compared to their total size. So the opportunity is there. I mean, China, for an example, right? Again, we can look at the combined size of China vis-a-vis everything else on that map. The second thing which I'd like to flag here is obviously the pricing around things and the market structure. While it does not show it here clearly, but what we can see that your cost of services is not always the cheapest in emerging countries and the most expensive in developed countries. It's a matter of how you can allocate the cost, how you can grow that business in a certain city state versus a certain large country. How many operators are there? What are the alternatives? To your point, Mark, again, competition is good. There are some reflections here of lack of competition, but that competition does not necessarily need to be in infrastructure. It can be in service. It can be in last mile delivery. So the opportunity is clearly there, and China to me is a stark example of what's out there for a lot of other nations. Again, I can't go there, but even city states are pretty much similar revenue size as compared to most of the large economies in Asia. Just a couple of things on the right. While we do get the gigabit speeds and all, the reality is the average download speed today in emerging Asia is still far behind developed. The use cases are actually not that far behind, right? Use cases are pretty similar now, especially post-COVID. What is also more interesting is, again, if you see the chart on the bottom, this is the FTTX share of fixed broadband. Now, average for emerging Asia versus developed Asia is not too far off, but at least what I understand, the more recent build-outs and the more recent investments APAC actually has a higher FTTX share because these are newer investments. The developed world obviously has some legacy assets as well. So again, certain countries obviously lag a lot, and we again spoke at length about sort of about where this can be rolled out and where it may not be very economically efficient. But that said, it's not too far out, and I think it's largely contributed by the fact that the use cases, the densities of population in sort of key cities in emerging Asia are not too dissimilar from developed markets. If I just move to the next page, again, I'm sure we all know this, but just some stats, right? So what's the service now? And again, if you all look back a little bit, I think there was a time when we would sort of religiously look for that SMS or sort of look for that phone call. Now it's all internet, right? As long as we have an internet connection, that's all we need. So if you look at that chart on the left, that's just one example. That's Indonesia. Sort of the mobile voice sort of traffic vis-a-vis the OTT voice traffic, we don't talk less. I haven't added it up, but if you add these two sides, it's pretty much the same. It's just that the usage has moved predominantly towards OTT services, and what that has done is, if you look at the chart at the bottom, is for most countries, for most telcos, and again this is not uncommon, right? I think this is pretty common knowledge, but if you look at most telcos in Asia, they have declining ARPUs. And this is over the last sort of, call it 4 or 5 years, the average CAGR. And noticeably, if you see the country which has the biggest decline and the country which has, again, the least decline, if you go to the previous page, where they fare in the penetration of fixed broadband, right? And the availability of services. So again, it's all moving towards that internet connection. There have been places, I know Hong Kong used to have, a certain operator used to have a nationwide sort of, call it wireless network, which you could hop on and hop off from, even when you're using sort of 4G. So it's a matter of time. It'll all get there. If you look at the parts on the right, again, there's no penetration numbers here. Again, definition of broadband, right? So most countries in Asia, and this is largely developing Asia, right? Most countries are already at pretty high 4G plus 5G penetration rates. And this is penetration per pop. There'll still be sort of cases here where, people may have two phones in the more developed parts and somebody may not even have a phone in an emerging part, right? So these are averages to say, but by 2025, each of these countries will be at least 100% 4G plus 5G penetration. Each of these countries, right? So the internet would be largely available. The delivery and the form, again, that's going to differ largely by countries. The chart on the bottom left. So what's happening here? I think in most parts of Asia, a lot of that demand of internet, a lot of that usage is being captured on the wireless part of it. It's not really captured on the fixed line part. So the bottom part is the expected fixed broadband revenue growth in developed and emerging Asia, 1% for developed and 8% for emerging. Now again, there could be a debate here as to what is 5G? Is 5G a pure wireless technology, or is it a sort of hybrid wireless plus fixed line technology? Again, we can get there, but the stats are quite telling, right? It's not even expected, as we sit here, for fixed broadband revenues to grow by more than 10% in and across Asia, right? Developed Asia is a meager 1%. To me, that is very telling. The opportunity is clearly there. That was the previous slide. Now, how can we look at this slightly differently? Again, these are all business models which exist, and partly why has that happened in a way is the key models that exist for broadband, right? We spoke at length about how we service the developed world versus or the denser and sort of call it the more affluent parts of the world versus the less. The three sort of large models that at least I've seen, starting with the first, which is the telco-driven model, and that's traditionally been sort of partly for broadband, partly for their own use cases. It has its own merits. It's got sort of pretty good synergies with the wireless business that they have, which is the backhaul part of it. Not necessarily something that needs to be in-house, but has the right synergies for them. I also feel there's an element of strategic access to these assets, right? I think towers in the past were supposed to be very strategic. People were reluctant to sell them. They are where they are today. Same for fiber, right? Fiber, people do actually price these assets pretty heavily today. And there is that reluctance to lose them, or at least open that up in general. Again, there are obviously negatives to it as well, the higher capex and opex, and hence you see people focusing on areas where they can actually get the right returns. Which again, the other parts, which is utilization, network availability, they're all pretty linked. This, again, the regulatory risk part of it is somewhat driven by the fact that these are largely private investments. So not sort of, and in some countries there are sort of government telcos as well, but this is largely for the private part. And that's what is there predominantly in Asia at least. The second model is the national government supported model. Again, there in some parts like Singapore, again, Malaysia has HSBB. And I know most nations have a certain program, varying degrees of progress on the program, right? This and the last bits are not too dissimilar in terms of their effect. But again, the access to and the source of capital is different, right? And the ultimate end goal objective can also be different. So for the government supported programs, it effectively is partly opening up the infrastructure, or at least making sure the infrastructure is available to people at a cost. This helps serve people, this again, the part that I was talking about, that certainty of use. This can somewhat relatively better enable people going in rural areas. Again, that doesn't solve the problem completely. What this also comes with is the fact that there are low barriers to entry, right? So if I'm running a large fixed broadband business, I wouldn't want that to happen, because then people can come in and they can just lease these lines and start offering these services. With government involved, there's obviously sort of lesser regulatory risk. The last bit is what I'll link to the next page right after that is third-party capital, right? And again, I've said third-party sale and leaseback. That generally applies to the more affluent parts of the world, the higher, denser parts of the world, not really to the less dense parts, because there may not be there may not be much to sell. So we can look at this as sale and leaseback, or call it a pure greenfield new investment. Now, again, we've seen this in towers. The growth rate of towers has dramatically changed in certain countries. Myanmar, for an example, different state today, but when they started, they effectively had no telco-owned towers. It was all third-party towers, right? And it was completely successful. There was no issues around services and the fact that 3 or 4 telcos were competing. So sale and leaseback effectively is an existing network being sort of spun out, enters into a contract with the parties that that own them, and sort of works out the right rate of return. What this does ultimately is it provides, again, depends on how the country is. So if you do that in where there are 40 networks today, how do you do that? Do you put all the 40 in a certain vehicle? It can take various shapes and forms, but in effect, it's about bringing the network out, opening it up to investors who would be looking to sort of invest in this commercially. And to my mind, this works in broadband when it's centralized. You cannot have 15 of these companies as well. Largely similar benefits and sort of largely similar cons to the national government model. But what I'd leave the stage with is this slide. And again, I haven't put exact numbers here to sort of keep it light. But if you look at where equity investors value some of these businesses, so this is EV to EBITDA multiple for integrated telcos, and that's pretty much. I mean, I have the numbers here. That's somewhere around, call it the high single digits mark. For broadband, it's 10.5. For towers, it's a good 14, 15 times. Now that's slightly counterintuitive, because end of the day, a tower company gets all their revenues from a telco, but investors value certainty, right? And investors then value the fact that this can grow in the right direction. The assets can be sweated better. A single tower can have a lot more tenants. Sale and lease back on that is at sort of, if I look at the last 12 months, is happening at even a higher rate, because a lot of capital is chasing certainty in general. Same for DCs. Again, that's just there to show, that, these asset classes can be valued pretty highly by investors. Now, when you look at the debt investors, which is, the sort of the bank debt providers, again, very similar trend. You would normally see, call it anywhere from 2 to 4 times debt to EBITDA leverage for the telcos, which is either wireless, fixed line, broadband integrated, which is the first two. But you get to towers and you can see anywhere from 4 to 9. You get to data centers, you can see, things even north of things in the double digits as well. Now, just going back to the previous slide and leaving it there, sale and leaseback. In today's market, there's a lot of value to be generated, right? I mean, just if you're spinning something off with a $50 EBITDA and there's a 10 times multiple differential, that's $500 million of value created right there and then. And people are willing to finance it, both debt and equity. So I'll stop here. I think my time's up as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishesh, both for the kind of perspectives, the vital, distinct perspective in that presentation, but also the contribution to the panel conversation before that. We'll move on to our final presentation of our session together now, where my Omdia colleague, research practice leader, Adrian Ho, is going to talk to us a little bit about the importance of greater broadband investment from a demand perspective, and also leveraging some World Broadband Association custom survey data from a study that we conducted earlier this year, where we surveyed 75 operators, 75 enterprises from around the world. And that's what we'll take a look at in this final presentation. Adrian.
Thank you everyone for staying for this last presentation. I know it's not easy, it's 4 p.m. Anyway, I'm Adrian. I'm based out of South Africa as well. I'm the practice leader for digital enterprise services. Now, topic for today, I've been in this industry for 20 years. The topic today is the importance or the need for greater broadband investment. I feel I've been talking about it, I've been discussing this for the last 20 years as well. But somehow, as a consumer, I just find it very hard to understand why the ROI or the choice or the decision to make greater broadband investment difficult. I mean, digitization, it was rightly pointed out in the panel, is applications driven, and without which it is really nothing. And for the experience, for the effectiveness of those applications to work and to function, whether you are an enterprise or a consumer, the underlying platform will always be broadband driven. Now, as Mark has said, a lot of this part of this presentation comes from a survey we did with Omdia as well as Huawei as well as the World Broadband Federation. So what's the demand of the ordinary citizen today? Now, I think the vast majority of us are very happy that we have COVID-19 behind us. But COVID-19 also changed the way we live, changed the way we interacted, changed the way we engage with customers, engage with each other. So this is a very simple question. How have we changed how have we changed our lives over the last 24 months as a result of COVID? 3 things really stood out. I think virtual working, remote working, the ability to work anywhere, anytime, any place. I think there's a realization, at least this belief, that today our work has become very virtual. There's also a change in lifestyle. I think there's a greater appreciation of a work-life balance. As a result, a lot of us are no longer working the 4 corners of an office. I think some of our surveys have shown something like 1/3 to 40% of employees are now outside an office at any one time. So the importance, the fundamental importance of having ubiquitous broadband becomes very important, so that that employee is able to execute his job anywhere, anytime, any place in the same effectiveness as he or she would have back in an office place. The second thing we realize, I think everyone, that we engage very differently today. I know a lot of people who have never gone online shopping before or engaged with customer service in an online platform, whether it's a chat or whether it's an email. They used to do it by phone. That has changed as well. The way customers engage, businesses engage with customers have changed. So the whole online digital experience become very pivotal. It's a crucial battleground, customer engagement. It is very important because it is the way we decide and do things today. Thirdly, the way we entertain ourselves, online gaming, online streaming has taken off during the pandemic, whether you are a Netflix watcher, whether you're a BritBox watcher, whether you're Amazon Prime, whether you game, whether you're a gamer. the consumption, the usage literally soared over the last 2.5 years. And lastly, looking to the future, we are definitely in an era of a very aging population, especially in certain parts of the world. The whole concept of remote healthcare, assisted living will become a reality sooner than expected. So the world has changed over the last 2.5 years. The importance of broadband in enabling a lot of these applications become more pivotal than ever. That's from a consumer standpoint. Now, from an enterprise standpoint, we ask enterprises across the world a whole set of questions, whether you agree, disagree, or strongly agree with a whole set of statements. Now, three things really stood out. As I mentioned earlier, digitization is applications driven, without which it is nothing. More than 50% of enterprises, especially the large enterprises, clearly stated that they will increase broadband spending, or the need for reliable broadband is more important than ever because they want the applications needed to be supported to an optimal level. Secondly, work-life balance. I think there's a realization among many organizations of to enable virtual working or a hybrid workforce, and that ability to provide that ubiquitous connectivity becomes more important than ever. That's from the enterprise. And the third thing that stood out was that businesses realize they need to have good IT capability to support their remote workers. The broadband infrastructure becomes more important than ever. Now, I think this topic was talked about in literally every single presentation today. There's definitely inequality in this world. I don't think we need to talk about it extensively again. What has been said throughout the day is that countries with more mature and more widespread broadband penetration has seemed to experience faster economic growth. They seem to be able to deliver that demographic dividend to the entire population. They're able to enable the workforce to be more productive. There's so many stats, either from ITU, OECD, and EIB that shows the ability to increase productivity when broadband penetration increase, the ability to demonstrate faster economic growth when broadband penetration increase. This is a snapshot of the global broadband penetration by region, by the speed of the connectivity as well. Not surprising, as we discussed this comprehensively throughout the day. Places like North America and Europe, broadband penetration is much higher, and these are the very regions that have experienced faster economic growth over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, the question has also been raised whether government should play a role. I think government, in theory, I'm not in favor and a strong advocate of government involvement because they usually mess things up. They usually don't operate in a more in an efficient way compared to the private sector. But when it comes to basic infrastructure, I think government has a role to play, especially with a strong government-private partnership. As you've seen in many countries across the world, especially in the country I come from, Singapore, whenever there's strong government-private partnership, it always enables strong infrastructure. And as a result, you get more rapid, stronger, robust economic growth. Now, the impact on telcos, providers, and beyond. I think the big question I talked about earlier as to why service providers has always struggled to produce or invest more in broadband is because of the ROI. And there was a lot of discussions today about innovative applications. As I mentioned earlier, digitization is about applications. Innovation will come from the application itself, and this is where monetization, return on investments will come from for the average service provider. Now, countries that have telcos that have experienced or have delivered faster broadband or more ubiquitous broadband, these are some of the distinctive benefits that they have derived. So you look from top to bottom, increase ARPU. Increase ARPU as a result of better applications, increase ARPU because of people willing to pay premium, consumers and businesses willing to pay premium to get faster broadband as opposed to broadband that is a little bit more shaky. That's one. Secondly, reduce churn. I've heard this many times as a consumer, if you are happy with the speed of the broadband, if you're happy with the stability of the broadband, the chances of you moving to a different service provider, even for a lower price, is greatly reduced. So improved churn or reduced churn, service providers like the one in Spain and Bell Canada have seen their churn rate reduce as a result of launching high-speed fiber services to both the metro areas as well to suburban areas as well. Reduced operational costs is one of them. And lastly, reduce energy consumption as well. Now, if you look at the chart on my right, increased broadband ARPU. This is how service providers can dramatically improve their overall revenue. A 5% increase in ARPU translates globally to $17 billion increment in overall broadband revenue. A 10% increase in ARPU translates to 34 billion, 20%, 68 billion. And a lot of that increase in ARPU, as we have discovered or experienced over the last decade, is a result of two things. People paying for value-added services. That's where the innovation comes into play. In services, we include a lot of it is applications, whether it's consumer-driven or enterprise-driven. And secondly, reduced churn, loyalty as a result. And as a result of that, service providers can implement increase in pricing, as we have seen today, as a result of inflation as well. Now, the next question is, we ask a whole set from a consumer standpoint. Now, this question came from a SME survey. The question was, we asked a whole set of questions to small and medium-sized businesses across the world. One of the questions we asked is, how would your spending or expenditure differ between 2022 to 2021 on a whole set of services and hardware products? So it ranges everything from cybersecurity, Wi-Fi management, network management, applications, and so on. Now, from the SME sector, that's anything below 250 employees. Broadband was the number one item or number one service whereby they will increase spending in 2022 over 2021. And the reasons for that many, and one of the main reasons that was stated is basically to support their remote workers or their virtual workforce, and secondly, to support the increasing amount of applications, both on-premise as well as cloud applications that SMEs are deploying globally and within their enterprise as well. Now, this is the current status of what we call the Fiber Development Index that Omdia has developed. I'm not going to go through each single line item, but basically the higher percentage it is, the more it's a reflection of how mature each of those categories are. So long story short, there's a lot of work to be done. There's only 62% of broadband penetration in 2021. Fiber to the premise is only 43% and so on. So as those results earlier shown, as you spread the broadband penetration globally, your ARPU increases. As a result of your ARPU increasing, your addressable market increases as well. So there's a lot of incentive for service providers to invest in broadband. So if you look on the chart on my left, there's been so much discussion over the last 10 years about how the network market is dying literally, and there's no longer any growth in networking service at all globally, and even in emerging markets. In some ways, that's true. But if you look at the chart on my left, broadband expenditure or services revenue is actually growing globally, but up to about 6% on an annual CAGR, as opposed to MPLS and private lease lines, which are declining. So overall market opportunity, addressable market globally for broadband is increasing. It is actually increasing quite rapidly in this part of the world. It's high single digits as opposed to low single digits or mid single digits in North America and in Europe. Now, so there's a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about why service providers are not gung-ho about putting more capital into increasing broadband infrastructure. Government has a role to play, as you mentioned before, return of investments, equity, and so on. So much discussion. We polled operators across the world, and these really are the main reasons as to why they won't put more money, or they struggle to justify putting more capital into broadband infrastructure. No surprise, cost of deployment is one of them. It will be very hard for a lot of service providers to engage with private equity or any large financing company to get better terms. And that's why I think government has a role to play. Second factor is lack of information over location and access to existing infrastructure. Second question we ask is what kind of important regulatory requirements, intervention is required or to be explored. Number one is reduction in regulatory barriers, and secondly, greater flexibility in partnership. I think greater flexibility in partnership will include both government as well as private sector, including all the big financial houses as well. So that really is the presentation for today. The final word is, I think, will sum up everything we discussed today. How can service providers actually justify increased broadband investment? It's really two things. I think it's innovation. Innovation will come from the application itself, whether you're reselling it or whether you're doing it organically. And I think this is one area whereby telcos have always not done well, is anything that's applications driven. And this is one area whereby building a partnership of ISVs, building that whole developer ecosystem becomes very important in the digital world, because digitization is about applications. And if you don't get that right, you will not get you will not thrive, basically. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. And yeah, I think some particularly pertinent final conclusions there at the end of that presentation. Before we close for the afternoon, I'd like to invite back on stage World Broadband Association Director General Martin Kriener for his closing remarks.
Thanks to everyone for the people who were contributing and presenting. Absolutely excellent. I think the people who have stayed and listened and we'll take away some of these ideas as well. As we say, this is a Friday afternoon and beer is waiting for many of us. Few final thoughts going away from all of this. First of all, I think this set of presentation kind of shows very clearly how broad a church the World Broadband Association's set of interests are actually. We had, first of all, some really good insight into how rapidly the technology is advancing, particularly China Telecom, China Unicom's presentations, the sophistication and speed of movement of the technology, the standards surrounding that, and the art of the possible in excellence in implementation and innovation, I think really shone out from those presentations. We also saw very clearly from a number of presentations, particularly from Atsuko's presentation, the importance of broadband. One of the numbers, I've seen some views in terms of the importance of broadband linking to GDP, but the linking of broadband to COVID deaths really stood out for me in that presentation. And just what we are doing here, and if we can move this on and move this forward, particularly in the developing parts of the world, will make genuine, important differences to people's lives, people's health, people's livelihood. I think it was very clear from a number of presentations the complexity of how financing this is going to be. And I thought we had an excellent panel session there talking about some of the opportunities and some of the ideas around it. And of course, Visesh's presentation afterwards, outlining the different possibilities between the telco funded versus government funded versus some sort of partnership approaches. All of those are really interesting, and I was particularly taken with his analysis of the potential EBITDA ratios that you get and the P2E ratios that you get in some of these partnership funded approaches versus when it's all bundled into a single telco. And that's a point I'm sure many telcos listening and watching today will take away. And then finally, great presentation at the end from Adrian, pulling together some of the key facts and data to show that there's data backing up the importance of all of this. So a really excellent day's work, but of course we are, in my view, right at the starting blocks. We're not at the finishing line. We've come up with an organization that's trying to address a very broad set of challenges that are everything from technology to finance to sustainability to global economy and politics. And what we want to do is to thread a really interesting way through this that's going to move forward on behalf of all the stakeholders. So many thanks for your attendance, your patience, and I wish you all a safe trip back to wherever you will be traveling to. Thank you very much.